it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink and listen. Military supernatural stories captivate us by blending the stark realism of warfare with the eerie allure of the unknown, creating a potent mix of tension and intrigue. These narratives often explore themes of bravery, sacrifice, and the human psyche under extreme stress, juxtaposed against otherworldly forces that defy logical explanation. This combination heightens the stakes, making every encounter unpredictable and thrilling. The supernatural elements allow for a deeper exploration of fear, courage, and the unknown, resonating with our innate curiosity about what lies beyond the ordinary and our fascination with the limits of human endurance and resilience. As we'll see in tonight's collection of stories by the ever-wonderful Taxi Dancer. Now, these are stories that have appeared on the channel before, but this is the first time I've put them all together in one long compilation for your listening pleasure. So, without further ado, here we go with The Ghosts of Fort Riley. I'd completely forgotten about these events until 20 years later I hooked up with my buddy Rob when we found ourselves in the same unit deploying to Afghanistan. Fort Riley in Kansas is home of the famous U.S. Army 1st Infantry Division. It's one of the Army's oldest and most haunted posts. I was a member of the Big Red One, the nickname for the 1st Infantry Division. I served as a member of the division's Air Defense Battalion. We had a live fire exercise coming up, and so the day before we had a 2.5-ton truck called a Deuce and a Half, loaded with thousands of 20mm ammunition rounds for our M163 Vulcan tracks, which we would fire at remote-controlled drones the next day. The truck with the ammunition was parked in what was called an ammunition staging area, or ASA, located somewhere deep in the forest. The ammunition needed to be guarded at all times prior to the unit picking it up and transporting it to the firing point, and me and my battle buddies Jerry and Rob were detailed to be the night guards. We were all just privates at the time, and we dutifully piled in the back of an HMM-WV, along with our sleeping gear, flashlights, books, and anything else we thought we needed to pass the time, along with jugs of water, a case of MREs, and a cooler of iced drinks. We were also armed with 2 hardwood batons, about 3 feet long, just in case. The driver of the HMM-WV was the sergeant of the guard, named Sergeant Herring. He was a short man who was overweight, out of shape, and had the reputation of being lazy and not a particularly effective squad leader. Sergeant Herring drove us down the hardball road, out behind the battalion motor pool, which turned off onto the tank trails, which led to the firing ranges and maneuver training areas where battalions of 1st Infantry Division tanks and armoured fighting vehicles regularly conducted war game exercises. We bounced around in the back for a few miles over meandering fields and low wooded hills, before Sergeant Herring turned off the main tank trail to follow a smaller dirt trail which led deeper into the forest. It was 4 in the afternoon, and the 3 of us stuck in the back of the bouncing cargo compartment of the HMM-WV said nothing, while we tried to get comfortable and catch a nap. Sergeant Herring turned around, backtracked, took different trails, and then back again, obviously lost. Finally, however, he found the trail that he needed to take, which led us down into a shallow valley. He was flooring the HMM-WV down the winding trail, which was only wide enough to allow 1 vehicle, which jostled us around even more in the back. Recklessly, Sergeant Herring followed the dirt trail up a slight incline, which led to another hardball road. The incline led to a low plateau with a square compound built on it. The compound was simply a concrete parking lot about a 1/4 mile square, surrounded by 2 chain-link fences topped with razor wire. Parked in the center of the parking lot underneath the lights was a Deuce and a Half truck with the ammunition. 2 one-story shacks were built outside the fence next to the gate, which led into the fenced-in parking lot, and Sergeant Herring parked the HMM-WV next to the smaller of the 2 shacks. "Get your gear and get the hell out," yelled Sergeant Herring from the driver's compartment. "This is going to be home until we're relieved tomorrow." Me, Rob, and Jerry jumped out of the back of the HMMWV and gathered our gear. The door to the small shack opened, and another squad leader, a lean, good-natured staff sergeant with a handlebar moustache named Staff Sergeant Sleet, came out saying, "You're late, Sergeant Herring. It's almost 1800 hours. My guys are going to miss dinner chow at the mess hall. Did you get lost again?" "No, I did not get lost," said Sergeant Herring, offended. But we just smiled and nodded at Staff Sergeant Sleet, behind Herring's back. 3 other soldiers emerged from the larger shack, which turned out to be the guard shack. They were friends of ours from Staff Sergeant Sleet's squad who'd had the day shift guard duty. We exchanged greetings as they piled into the HMMWV to go back to the main post at Fort Riley, their duty day completed. Staff Sergeant Sleet climbed into the driver's seat and said, "Hey, Sergeant Herring, 1st Platoon will be coming to relieve you at 0800 tomorrow. They'll be bringing out hot chow for breakfast." Staff Sergeant Sleet then yelled back at his team, "Hey guys, we aren't going to make the chow time tonight, so pizza's on me. Sergeant Herring got lost again." The soldiers in the back of the HMMWV laughed as Staff Sergeant Sleet pulled away from the compound. As they turned onto the dirt trail, my buddy Paul, who was sitting in the back of the HMMWV, suddenly yelled to me, Rob, and Jerry, "Hey, watch out for ghosts. They say this SAA is haunted." We stood there watching the vehicle disappear, and I turned to Sergeant Herring and said, "What did he mean by this ASA is haunted?" "Ah, nothing. It's nothing," replied Sergeant Herring, sounding angry and flustered. Sergeant Herring pointed at the larger shack and said, "Throw your gear in there. That's where you 3 will be spending the night. You'll each be doing roving patrols around the perimeter of the fence in 1-hour shifts. You," Sergeant Herring pointed at me, "I saw how you laughed when Sleet said I got lost. You pull first guard rotation. Get out of there." "Do we have radios?" I asked. "You know, in case of ghosts." "Ah, knock it off," said Herring. "We don't need comms because there's no such thing as ghosts." In other words, Sergeant Herring had forgotten to bring the radios, meaning we had no communication between the ASA and our headquarters if something unexpected should occur way out here in the middle of nowhere. Herring gathered his gear, including a small portable television, a cooler, and a mini grill, and stomped off towards the smaller guard shack that was meant for the sergeant of the guard and had electricity and air conditioning. Jerry and Rob took our gear and walked towards the guard shack, while I secured one of the wooden batons and began my patrol around the perimeter fence. Each side of the fence was a 1/4 mile long, and a small path circled the outside of the fence lot. The guard shacks were located on the eastern side of the fence. The north and south sides were clear of foliage, and the plateau dipped steadily about 10 to 20 feet down towards the forest. On the west side, however, the forest grew right up to the fence line. I began walking around the perimeter, enjoying the sounds of nature, the cool breeze and the crimson sky as the sun slowly set in the west. When I turned the corner to walk the western side of the fence, however, the trees seemed to swallow all light, and it felt colder, although there was no breeze. Also, there didn't seem to be any animal noises, such as birds chirping. I completed that 1/4 mile stretch, and when I emerged on the north side of the fence, the birds' chirping noise returned. I completed the circuit about 4 times before my hour was up, and I returned to the guard shack where Jerry was getting ready for his shift. I didn't say anything about how weird I'd felt walking the 1/4 mile section of the western perimeter, and just rolled out my sleeping bag on the bare concrete floor. Heated up an MRE meal of tuna with noodles and washed it down with an iced soda from the cooler, while talking with Rob about when he was going to get up with that exotic dancer from Tiger Island in Junction City. An hour later, Jerry had completed his shift, and Rob left to take his turn. It was getting darker, and there was no electricity in our guard shack, so Jerry and I just sat around eating snacks, while Jerry bugged me about when I was going to get up with that exotic dancer at Tiger Island in Junction City. At 9 p.m, Rob had completed his shift, and I got up to begin my second guard rotation. Rob handed me the baton and a flashlight. "Here," he said. "You'll need this." "Hey, thanks," I said. Then I noticed that Rob seemed a bit nervous. "You all right, man?" I asked. "Yeah," answered Rob. "It's just that the flashlight seems to go dim on the western perimeter, where the woods go all the way up to the fence. Probably just because of the trees." "Yeah, probably," I said. "Or maybe it's ghosts." I stepped outside of the shack and breathed in the warm night air, grateful for the breeze. The moon was out and full, which bathed everything in a soft light. The lights inside the ASA were lit and shone brightly down on the ammunition truck. Lights were also on in Sergeant Herring's shack, although he'd pulled down the blinds. God, even at this distance I could hear the sounds of a porn movie being played on his television. I shuddered and hoped he'd also locked the door. The perimeter lights were on and shining brightly on the north, south and east sides of the fence, but for some reason the lights on the west side had failed to come on. When I turned the corner of the western perimeter, everything seemed to go pitch black. I could clearly see all sides of it, but the western side of the perimeter was totally dark, even with the moon fully shining. I turned on the flashlight that Roy had given me. Sure enough, it was weak, as if low on battery. The fence was on my right and the forest was to my left as I walked that portion of the perimeter. The flashlight barely illuminated the path and trees 5 feet in front of me, and the whole time I felt as if I were being watched by something. I cursed at Paul for putting the thought in my head that this place was haunted, and secretly hoped that he'd caught an STT from that exotic dancer from Tiger Island. The quarter-mile walk from the dark western perimeter seemed to take hours, but eventually I made it to the corner where the forest was no longer at the fence line, and the perimeter lights worked. The sun shone brightly in the sky, and for some reason my flashlight shone a powerful beam of light again. Curious, I turned around and walked back the way I'd come. My flashlight dimmed like before. Stupid flashlight. Well, I completed my 4 circuits around the perimeter fence, north, east, south, and then west, but always dreading that west side. As I said earlier, it felt as if someone or something was watching me from somewhere inside the inky black void of the forest. At 10 p.m. my shift was up, and Jerry met me at the shack, ready to take his turn as the roving guard. The sound of that porn movie was still coming from Sergeant Herring's shack, and Jerry rolled his eyes and shook his head. 3 hours straight, he said, and we both laughed. I handed Jerry the baton and told him about the flashlight issue, but didn't mention how creeped out I'd felt walking the western perimeter. Jerry thanked me, warned me that the MRE chili mac that Rob ate for dinner was causing him to pass gas in his sleep, then put on headphones before beginning his guard shift. I walked into the now pitch-black guard shack and felt my way to my sleeping bag. Although I thought I was too wired up to sleep, I quickly did so. I woke up at 11 p.m. when Jerry's shift was over. Listening to Rob tell Jerry that the MRE tuna with noodles that I'd had for dinner was making me pass gas in my sleep. It was dark inside the shack, save for the moonlight streaming in from the windows and open door. Jerry responded, but sounded rather worried. Scared, even. Jerry mentioned hearing something on the western side of the fence, but he couldn't make it out. He said it sounded like horses and the thunder of hooves, but it sounded faint. Feeling somewhat vindicated, I said to Rob as he left for his patrol, "Don't let the ghosts get you." Midnight came quickly, and I was pulling on my boots to begin my shift. Of course, I would get the midnight shift. I met Rob at the front of the shack, and perhaps it was a trick of the light for the moon, but at that moment Rob was the whitest black guy I'd ever seen. He didn't look at me, but kept staring out at the western perimeter. "Man, there is definitely something out there," Rob said. Every time I walked that part of the fence, the flashlight got dim and I kept hearing something. Something, I said. Well, I haven't heard anything. You will, said Rob. It sounds like, I don't know, like horses and yelling, but really faint, just like Jerry said. Go get some sleep, man, I said as I nervously took the baton and the flashlight from Rob. Yeah, I'll take care of Casper for you. I have to warn you, though, that you might want to keep the window open. That MRE spaghetti and meatballs that Jerry had for dinner is making him pass gas in his sleep. So now it was my turn, and it was midnight. Admittedly, with some trepidation, I walked the south perimeter fence and turned to walk the western side. Once again, as soon as I turned the corner, my flashlight dimmed as I walked that dark quarter-mile corridor. I felt as if I was not even there, as if I was somehow outside myself and I was watching me walking underwater. Yes, it felt as if I were underwater, as it had grown cold and the air thick and hard to breathe. A mist had also risen up, further obscuring what little I could see ahead of me. The lights indicating the north perimeter seemed miles away. Then, about halfway down the western perimeter fence, I heard something off to my left, coming deep from within the forest. It sounded like horses galloping back and forth. It was faint, but it was definitely there. There was also something else. It was a feeling somewhat akin to panic, but it wasn't something I was feeling. It was like I knew there was panic, but it wasn't coming from me. I completed my first circuit around the fence and almost eagerly walked at a quick pace to get to the western side. Once again, the warm night air was replaced by an almost graveyard-like cold and mist. At about the same spot, I could hear it again. The sounds drifting in from somewhere in the dark forest of horses running. But this time it seemed closer than before. The sounds more distinct. Also, I could hear some of the horses whinnying, as if they were in pain. I tried to shake it off, still arguing with myself that this was just my imagination. The thought of horses in pain suddenly made me feel sad. I'm sorry I got you into this, boy. We've been through a lot together. I'm sorry, boy. They ain't taking any prisoners. I ran to the lights, marking the north perimeter. God, what was that? What was it I'd just felt? It was sadness, but it wasn't mine. What was going on? I looked at my watch under the lights. My shift was almost over, but how? I mean, it usually took me 4 circuits around the perimeter, but I'd barely gone 2. I completed my circuit and walked past Sergeant Herring's shack. 5 hours of washing, Paul? Really, Sergeant Herring? And headed towards our guard shack. Jerry was already waiting for me to get back so he could start his shift. Anything new and exciting? Jerry asked. Oh, you'll see, I answered. What does that mean? Jerry asked, taking the baton and the flashlight from me. Did you hear something out on the western side where the forest comes up to the fence? Well, I don't know, I answered. Maybe, but just be careful. I was sitting up on my sleeping bag, leaning my back against the concrete wall and trying to figure out what I'd just experienced. Sadness, regret, but they weren't my feelings or my memories. I heard horses whinnying in pain, but I also swear that I heard human voices as well. About 20 minutes later, I heard a pounding on Sergeant Herring's shack. Rob and I got up and opened the door to see Jerry pounding on the door to Sergeant Herring's shack and yelling, What's out there, Sergeant? You know what's out there. What is it? Sergeant Herring never opened the door. Instead, he yelled from inside his shack. You just shut your mouth, Private, and do what you're told to do. Stop asking me stupid questions and get back out there, or I will write you up. Rob and I joined Jerry outside of Sergeant Herring's shack, and I said, Sergeant, it's me, Private Fox. What's out there? What are we dealing with? Sergeant Herring cursed from behind the door. Oh, it's Private Fox. Private question McQuestionberry. I said to stop asking questions. I swear if you don't shut your mouth and carry out your orders, I will write up all of you for insubordination. Now go away, leave me alone. Sergeant Herring sounded terrified. Out of all the ASAs on this base, they had to put me in charge of this one. Sergeant Herring complained. You'll all be fine. When it gets lighter, I'll show you. Show us what, Sergeant? I asked. I said, you'll be fine, screamed Sergeant Herring as he finally shut off his porn movies and everything went dark inside his shack. Now, go away. Leave me alone. Rob and I offered to go with Jerry to finish his shift, but Jerry declined. That's fine, Jerry said. I got this. At this point I could tell that Jerry was more disgusted with Sergeant Herring than he was afraid of whatever was on the western perimeter. At 2 a.m. Jerry's shift was over and Rob got up to take his place. Jerry didn't say anything when he got back to our shack. He simply shook his head as Rob went out the door. I'm not sleepy, I said. You want me to come with you? I'm good, answered Rob as he took the baton and the flashlight from Jerry and disappeared out the door. Jerry rolled into his sleeping bag, lost in thought. Although we were all experiencing the same phenomenon, I want to talk about it. We were soldiers with a job to do, and we would do what was required of us. There'd be plenty of time to sort out what happened later. I couldn't sleep, so I went outside to get some fresh air. Loud snoring was coming from Sergeant Herring's shack. I looked to the fence line and saw a figure standing under the lights at the south perimeter of the corner. It was Rob. He was standing stark still, staring west into the thick forest. I walked up behind him. I'm at your 6, Rob, I said so as to not startle him, but he still jumped at the sound of my voice. What are you doing here? He said. You still got another 30 minutes before you have to be on shift. I can't sleep, I answered. I can't move, said Rob. I can't bring myself to turn this corner and walk down that path. Come on, I said, leading the way. I'll go with you. As soon as we turned that corner, the flashlight went dim again. The mist seemed to be chest high now. The temperature seemed to be dropping the further we went down the fence line until, again, near the middle of that part of the fence, my fingers began to feel numb from the cold, as if I'd been submerged in ice. Stop, 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 whispered Rob. He shone the flashlight into the prevailing darkness, but it barely illuminated the trees, which seemed to reach out at us. Do you hear it? I nodded. This time the sound was unmistakable. Somewhere out in the distance of that solid black forest, a battle was taking place. The thunder of horses' hooves, the yelling of men, the battle cries of Native Americans, the screams of the dying. It was all there just beyond the reach of the pathetic illumination from our flashlight. I had an overwhelming sadness come over me. Somewhere brave men and horses were fighting and dying. Somewhere out there. And then it was gone. Rob's flashlight shone in full brilliance, illuminating the surrounding woods. The mist was gone as if it had never been there, and the cold air was replaced by a cool early morning breeze. I also realized that it had become easier to breathe again, and that the heaviness seemed to have been lifted. Rob and I looked at each other, the sadness also seeming to have vanished. We simply shrugged. I did my 3 a.m. guard shift around the perimeter, but nothing unusual happened, nor did anything unusual happen on either of Jerry or Rob's subsequent shifts. As promised, at 0800 in the morning, first platoon arrived with hot breakfast chow and time to take possession of the deuce-and-a-half truck and all of the 20mm ammunition. The sun was rising in the cloudless blue sky, and it promised to be a great day of shooting our Vulcan cannons. Sergeant Herring finally opened the door to his shack, appearing to be nicely rested. and helped himself to the lion's portion of the breakfast chow while complaining to the first platoon leader about how he doesn't get this new generation of lazy young soldiers. In fact, Sergeant Herring helped himself to so much breakfast chow that Jerry, Rob and I had to content ourselves with hot coffee and dry cereal. Eager to get out of the ASA, Sergeant Herring yelled at us to get our gear and get in the back of the HMMWV. Jerry, Rob and I just stared at him. "Sergeant," I said, "last night you said you'd show us what was out there when it became light." "Show you? Show you what?" stuttered Sergeant Herring. "I didn't say I was going to show you anything." "Sergeant," said Jerry, "you told us you'd show us what was out there in those woods." Sergeant Herring cursed again. "Private, I am ordering you to—" "Hey, isn't there a grave around here?" interrupted Lieutenant Cook, the first big platoon leader with the Ranger tab. "You know, Fort Riley used to be a horse cavalry post. I think it'd be a good learning moment to take these young soldiers to see the history of this place. Don't you agree, Sergeant Herring?" Yes, sir," gulped Sergeant Herring. "Do you know where those graves are located, Sergeant Herring?" asked Lieutenant Cook. "Yes," squeaked Sergeant Herring. "Well, take us there, Sergeant," smiled Lieutenant Cook. "I'd like to see it." Visibly pale, Sergeant Herring led us, Lieutenant Cook and about 15 other soldiers from 1st Platoon out to the back of the ASC, where the woods reached the western part of the perimeter. About midway was a small trail which led down off the plateau and into the woods. So small and narrow that one would easily overlook it, unless they knew exactly where to find it. In the darkness, Jerry, Rob and I had completely missed seeing it. The trail wound between thick trees and clinging vines as it descended deeper into the valley for about 150 meters, before emerging into a clearing about 25 foot square. There, in the middle of the leaf-strewn clearing, were true grave markers, each topped with the brass image of a horse. The names on the plaques had faded, so I couldn't read what was inscribed on them. The morning sun shone down through the trees upon this quiet and solemn place. "Sir," said Sergeant Herring, "buried here are 2 horses from General Custer's cavalry troop. They were killed at the Battle of Little Bighorn and brought back to Fort Riley to be laid to rest." And there you have it. Sergeant Herring had given us the answer to our mystery. None of us ever talked about what happened during our guard duty that night. As a soldier, you learn to accept things as they are, whether they be normal or paranormal, so long as nothing gets in the way of accomplishing the mission. It's just something that happens which soldiers have to adjust to in performing our duties. Army Scout hunted by Bigfoot, and vice versa. Looking back at almost 30 years of service as a soldier in the US Army, I can comfortably say that it was an honor and a privilege to serve such a great and remarkable country. During my time, I managed to acquire several combat military occupational specialties, or MOS, to include Vulcan Gunner, Stinger Gunner, Artillery Gunner, and Combat Infantryman. My favorite MOS, however, definitely has to be Cavalry Scout. As the name implies, an Army Cavalry Scout is the eyes and ears of the maneuvering combat battalion. We usually operate alone and far ahead of the main combat force, oftentimes behind enemy lines. Using stealth and silence, we locate enemy positions, determine where they've laid their mines, locate their barriers and ambush positions, and find ways to outflank their defensive positions. Now, to be a scout, you have to be able to act independently and confidently, because more often than not, Army Scouts will usually be outnumbered and surrounded. Conducting reconnaissance behind enemy lines is not a job for everybody, but if you're daring and crazy enough, it's a job that a select few would really enjoy. The one skill that an Army Scout needs, above all else, is the ability to read a map, determine your coordinates on the ground, and have the ability to navigate stealthily to your objective. A scout is virtually useless if he cannot read a map and ends up getting lost. As such, a large part of a scout's training consists of land navigation in all terrains, weather conditions and environments which include forests, dense woodland, deserts and swamps. While I was training to be a scout, our class was dropped out in the middle of a dense forest somewhere in Pennsylvania at 11 o'clock at night. It was a cool November evening, and the only illumination came from the full moon, which shone brightly in the sky. There were 16 of us who'd advanced to this phase of training, including one guy who was a former US Navy SEAL. We were each given a map, a compass, a red lens flashlight, water, night vision goggles, NVGs, and 4 hours to find at least 4 out of 5 points located on the map. Each point we had to find was located somewhere inside the black forest that surrounded us. Our point consisted of nothing more than a wooden pole sticking out of the ground with an ammunition can at the base. Inside the ammunition can was a description of an enemy position. For example, the description might read, "Enemy machine gun position facing north." The scout would then have to write down something like, "At vicinity grid AA 12345-67890, there is an enemy machine gun position facing north." Now, besides the darkness, there were several other factors working against us. For one, some of the points were located relatively close together, separated by about 20 meters or so, and this meant that the scout had to track precisely to the correct point or else risk navigating to the wrong point. Also, all 16 of us were given different points to navigate to, so there would be absolutely no helping each other. This was strictly an individual training event, and it was timed. Anyone who failed to successfully find their 4 out of 5 points in the designated time would have to come back tomorrow evening and try again. And finally, we were told that there were several enemy soldiers out there somewhere in the forest who would be hunting us. If one of them caught us, we would be brought back to the start point and have to do it all over again. The land navigation was a densely forested area, roughly 10 square miles, and was crisscrossed with streams which we would have to navigate in the dark. A dirt road surrounded the entire area, and if a scout came to a dirt road, he knew he'd reached a boundary. Also, if a scout became completely lost in the dark, he was to make his way to a dirt road and wait for pickup, and the joking and insults which were sure to follow. An instructor gave me a list of 5 points, and I went to the front of the HMMWV and used the hood as a makeshift table. Using my red lens flashlight, I plotted all 5 points on my map. This was perhaps the most important part of the process because if a scout plotted his points incorrectly on the map, he would never find his points, especially in a pitch-black forest. After double and triple checking that I had exactly corrected my plotted points, I studied the map to see what terrain I could expect. 2 of my points were located on small hilltops. 2 were located in a valley which would require me to cross 2 streams, and 1 was located near the boundary next to the dirt road. That last point was farthest out, but also the easiest to find. All my 5 points were located in an area roughly 3 miles square, and my plan was to find that last point first, then work my way back to the start point. The only variable that I could not control were the enemy soldiers who would be hunting us. After assuring that my NVGs operated correctly, I secured it on my forehead. Satisfied that I had all my gear secured to make as little noise as possible, I stepped off of the dirt road and plunged down into the black forest. Immediately, unseen branches, like skeletal fingers, reached out from the darkness to scratch my face and hands. I was only 20 meters inside the woodline, but already the sounds and activities behind me had all but disappeared. I slowly knelt, closing my eyes and letting my ears see into the darkness. To my left, about 10 meters away, one of my fellow scouts was also moving through the forest to find his points. Further ahead of me, I could hear movements somewhere in the forest, a skittering noise running through the undergrowth, perhaps a raccoon or some other rodent. The fallen leaves on the ground crunching underfoot would give away our movement, you'd have to be extra careful and stealthy to avoid attracting attention. I got up and continued walking towards my first point, counting my steps so that I could judge how far I'd travelled and keeping my eyes on my compass to ensure that I was heading in the correct direction. I was suffering from tunnel vision, as I could only see what was directly in front of me. I had almost no peripheral vision because of my NVGs. The terrain was steadily sloping downwards as I descended into the valley. Occasionally I would stop and kneel to scan my surroundings to see if I was being followed. So far, however, it was all quiet. It appeared that I was alone on this stretch of forest. At the bottom of the valley, the ground became muddy, and at one point I sank to the top of my boots in cold mud. A stream about 8 feet wide crossed in front of me. I debated on whether to cross the stream or find a way around it. Farther upstream by a few hundred meters, I heard a loud splash, followed by a soldier yelling, "Oh, son of a..." Well, I chuckled to myself and silently climbed down into the stream. Looking left and right to ensure I wasn't spotted, I climbed over a few fallen tree branches and waded into the water. It was ice cold and came up to my knees, but at least the running water was washing the mud off my boots. Upon reaching the other side, I climbed up the muddy shore on the opposite bank. Stopping briefly to make sure that I was undetected, I hauled myself up on an embankment and, wet, cold and muddy, continued up the slope of the valley. Fortunately, since it was November, mosquitoes or any other buzzing insects were a minor annoyance. However, as I walked up that slope, I slowly began to realize that I hadn't heard any buzzing insect noises at all. If you've done this job long enough, you begin to develop what I call a warning radar, a sense that there's something just not right with your surroundings. You learn to trust your warning radar, and I could swear that I was being watched. This annoyed me more than anything because I was the one who did the stalking. I did not like being stalked. At the top of the slope, I got on the ground and scanned the area again. Yep, there he was. About 50 meters to my right front, crouching behind a stand of trees, was an enemy soldier. He was looking away from me, probably trying to stalk the other soldier who'd yelled when he fell into the stream. Night sound carries further, so I very slowly crawled back down the slope and walked another 50 meters away from the enemy soldier and climbed the slope again. Scanning the area around me, I found that the path ahead was clear. I pulled out a poncho from a small pack on my back and covered myself with it. Pulling out my map and my flashlight, I determined how far off course I'd gone and adjusted my heading and pace count. Satisfied that I was still heading in the right direction, I put the poncho away and slowly stood up to proceed ahead. Suddenly, far off to my left, I heard the enemy soldier yell, "You've been captured, Scout. Return to the start point and restart your mission." I chuckled again when I heard the voice of the scout who'd fallen into the stream yell, "Oh, son of a..." I continued walking through the forest, and the trees eventually thinned out. I stopped again and took a knee behind a fallen tree, listening. My internal warning radar was giving me the all clear. I closed my eyes and let my ears see for me again. Ahead of me, I could hear the low rumbling of an HMMWV. Just as I calculated, the dirt road marking the perimeter was about 200 meters ahead of me. I waited until the sound of the HMMWV had passed by. Then I made my way to the road, stopping just inside the wood line. I looked right, and sure enough, only 20 feet away, just off the road, was my first point. I cautiously approached the wooden pole and grabbed the ammunition can and took it back into the tree line. I cracked open the ammunition can, and the noise of the metal can opening seemed to scream in the dark. I cursed, but apparently nobody heard the noise. Covering myself again with the poncho, I took out my flashlight and copied down what was written on the enemy description in the can. "At vicinity grid PB 335-44459 is an enemy patrol near the road." I put the ammunition can back at the point and walked back into the forest. An hour and a half had passed and I found my first point. I had another 2.5 hours to find at least 3 more points, but those would go quicker. My next 2 points were south of me, almost in a straight line on the slopes of a hill. Although it would have been easier to walk along the crest of the hill to get to my next point, I didn't want to risk being silhouetted by the moon, so I stayed below the crest of the hill, where the trees were thicker but the movement was slower. I paralleled to the top of the hill for about 300 meters until I came to the spot where my second point should be. Low crawling to the top of the hill, I scanned around with the NVGs. I was off by about 50 feet, but there was my second point sticking straight up in the middle of a clearing. I was about to get up and approach the point when my warning radar went off inside my head. I was not alone. I knelt back down and scanned the forest area surrounding the clearing again. A faint scent of feces, like cow dung, wafted across the clearing. There, 75 meters at my 1 o'clock, a figure looking like he was wearing a sniper's ghillie suit was peering out of the forest. It wasn't one of my fellow scouts because we didn't have the ghillie suit camouflage, so it must have been one of the enemy soldiers. Boy, did he stink. I hated to think what he'd fallen into. Fortunately, he wasn't looking in my direction. I observed him for a few tense seconds, then he stood up and turned to leave. Wow, that guy was huge. I waited a few more seconds until I couldn't smell him anymore, then I entered the clearing to retrieve the ammunition can. At vicinity grid PB 3009667 is an enemy anti-tank emplacement at the top of the hill. I came off the top of the hill, grateful to be back inside the thick tree line. But the leaves crunching under my boots sounded like the roar of jets in that dark and lonely forest. Every crunching seemed to shout, "Hey, there's a scout right here!" Crunch, 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 crunch. I stopped suddenly and slowly got down on my belly. Crunch, 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 crunch. The footsteps were behind me, approaching my position. I cursed. Stinky enemy soldier in the ghillie suit was stalking me. Well, he must have been beyond 75 meters from me because I didn't smell him. If I'd had the time, I would have evaded around him, but another 30 minutes had passed and I needed to get to my third point. I needed to get to where the trees weren't so thick, so I made my way back up the slope, was able to fast walk and jog across the crest of the hill for about a quarter mile. The bad part was that, because I'd chosen to go back up the slope, the full moon had illuminated me that whole time. Also, my pace count was off, although I knew that I was still headed generally in the right direction to my third point. I ran down the slope and back into the woodline again, stopping to see if stinky enemy soldier in the ghillie suit had followed me. Satisfied that I lost him, I began searching the area for my third point. Because I'd made a detour up the slope and had lost my pace count, I was not as accurate in positioning myself close to the third point. I just knew it was around here somewhere, here in a 50-meter radius. The bad thing about NVGs is that, while it gives the wearer an amazing ability to see in the dark, it also severely limits the wearer's depth perception. I found the point literally by accident when I inadvertently kicked over the ammunition can. The loud clang echoed in the night, and I shook my head, cursing my bad good luck. Pulling out my flashlight again, I copied down the enemy description that was inside of the ammunition can. At vicinity grid PB 2883475 is an enemy command post. I returned the ammunition can back to the point. I was turning to go to my fourth point when I could make out the faint smell of cow dung again. Man, enemy stinky soldier in the ghillie suit sure was fast for a big guy, as well as being persistent. It was almost 2 in the morning now, which meant that I had a little over an hour to find my fourth point. If I had any time left, I'd look for the 5th point, which was only a quarter mile from the start point. I turned due south and headed back down into the valley. The whole time my warning radar was going off in my head. Sometimes I thought I could smell the cow dung, and I secretly wished that stinky guy stalking me would fall into the stream. The trees were much thicker towards the base of the valley where the stream ran, so it was much darker with very little moonlight shining through. But it was still pleasantly cool, although I was hot and sweaty by this time. I calculated that I was at the bend in the stream, about 500 meters away from where I'd first crossed it. This 4th point was weird because it looked to be directly in the stream on my map, meaning it could be either on the bank or in the stream. I wasn't looking forward to searching both sides of the stream, but I didn't have much choice. I knew that my 4th point was here somewhere close by. I silently searched my side of the muddy stream first for about 50 meters. The rippling of the waters masked any noise I made, but it also masked the noise of any approaching bad guys as well. Finding nothing on my side of the stream, I once again climbed down an embankment and waded across the icy cold water to the other side and began my search again. I searched for another 50 meters and still saw nothing except mud and fallen trees. I was beginning to doubt that I'd plotted this point correctly when I looked at the stream again and noticed something that I hadn't seen before. In the middle of the stream was a narrow dry spot of land like a miniature 4-foot square island. In the middle of this little island was my 4th point. I waded back into the water, and after I covered myself with my poncho, I quickly opened the ammunition can. At Vicinity Grid PA 00958824 is an enemy submarine base. Really? I thought. A submarine base? Whatever. I closed the ammunition can and set it back down, when the smell of cow dung seemed to hit me like the heat you feel when you open a hot stove. I cursed. Even though I'd found the necessary points that I needed, I still had to get back to the start point without being caught, or else I'd have to do this all over again. God, how did Stinky Guy keep finding me? Very slowly, I knelt down on the island and crawled backwards into the freezing water. That smell was all around me, and there was a noise like branches breaking on the bank, followed by splashing sounds only 50 meters to my left. The moon shone down at the place where there was a bend in the stream, and outlined in it was a big, stinky enemy soldier guy. Most of my body was submerged in the water, with my upper body hugging that little strip of island in the middle of the stream. I looked up at the guy who was 50 meters away from me, and I gulped. What I had, at first thought, was a ghillie suit. Was actually fur. It was a good 7.5 to 8 feet tall, had a gorilla-like face, and was covered with dark, thick fur. The creature stood in the middle of the stream, looking around and seeming to sniff at the air. Oh, great, I thought. I'm being stalked by a Sasquatchfoot, or whatever the heck they're called. But since I know where you are, and you don't know where I am, I guess I'm stalking you now. I began wondering if I'd actually packed more beef sticks in my pack, since I saw a commercial once on television where the Sasquatchfoot things seemed to like beef sticks. All of a sudden, in the distance came the blaring of multiple horns, which seemed to echo all around the valley. I cursed again. It was a warning signal that all scouts had 30 minutes to finish finding their points and return to the start line. And by this point, I was more annoyed than I was frightened. I was wet, cold, irritated, and muddy. Fortunately, I'd wrapped my waterproof notebook with all my plot points inside of my waterproof poncho and kept it on the small island and out of the water. But still, I only had 30 minutes to make it back to the start line. But tall, dark, and Stinky was standing in the middle of the stream, looking around him like a lost grandpa at the mall. Oh, that big, hairy McDingleberry was going to cost me getting my recon scout qualification. It seemed like I lay there for hours, but in reality it was probably only a few seconds. After the horn started blaring, Big Stinky seemed to let out a huff and ran back up the embankment from which he'd emerged. I waited for the smell to dissipate before hauling myself out of the stream and double-timed it back to the start point. Although I was the last scout to return to the start point, I was feeling pretty good when our trucks brought us back to the barracks. 2 scouts had got lost and had to be picked up by the side of the road, and 2 other scouts failed to find 4 of their 5 points. These guys would have to try again tomorrow night. Well, only one guy, the foreman Navy SEAL, found all 5 of his points. And, well, although I only found just enough points to pass the course, I did also stalk a Bigfoot. How many other cavalry scouts can say that? Artillery versus mythology. My mother had arranged for one of my cousins to pick me up from the international airport in Manila during my last visit to the Philippines. Being Filipino myself, it seemed like every time I returned to visit my parents' native country, I am introduced to hundreds more cousins and relatives which I never knew I had. I'd never met this cousin, whom I'll call Juan, who came to pick me up on a warm, tropical evening. It was near midnight, but Manila was still alive with the lights and sounds and hustle and bustle of a crowded metro city. My cousin Juan, a slender young man sporting a military-style haircut, picked me up in an older model van, and after tossing my baggage in the back, we began the long and slow trip out of the city. I was on block leave from the army, having just returned from a deployment to the Middle East, and I came to the Philippines to relax and to get away from all things United States military. As we made our way slowly through the congested midnight streets, still filled with shoppers, vendors, tourists, and partygoers, my cousin asked me what I'd do in the U.S. Army. We had a good 5-hour drive to where I'd be vacationing near the beaches. I told him that I served as a platoon sergeant in an artillery unit. I'm also known as the Chief of Smoke, or simply Smoke. Well, my cousin Juan got very excited to hear this. As it turns out, he was also an artillery crew member in the Philippine Army, and he anxiously invited me to visit his artillery unit before my vacation was over. Naturally, I accepted the invitation, as I was quite anxious to see my fellow Filipino 13 Bravos. That's the U.S. Army designation of an artillery soldier. To see them in action. Yes, I came to the Philippines to get away from things that go boom really loudly, but I just couldn't pass this up. Towards the end of my vacation, my cousin Juan again picked me up, all dressed and looking tactic cool in his Philippine Army battle dress uniform, and took me to the base. I was very excited to see how the Filipino artillery units operated compared to the way we operated in the American artillery unit. Well, for one, I noticed that the Filipino battle dress uniform was pretty modern, resembling our own American uniforms with a similar digitized camouflage pattern, much like the ones our US Marines wear. Their equipment loadout was also basically the same as ours, with modular, load-bearing vests of ammunition pouches, grenades, first aid kits, and water, while their individual weapons ranged from 5.56 caliber M16s and M4 rifles, with the designated sharpshooters armed with the 7.62 caliber M14 rifles. All in all, I judged the individual Filipino artillery soldiers to be just as motivated, competent, and professional as the best soldiers that served in my unit. My only disappointment was with the old equipment that the Filipino artillerymen were using. Their main artillery gun was an old American M101, 105mm towed howitzer. Long retired from service with the United States Army, the M101 first saw service in 1941, and was now considered a museum piece by most of the Allied countries which used them. But the M101 howitzer still soldiered on with the Philippine military, and, in fact, the artillery piece which many of these young soldiers operated were the same artillery pieces which their fathers had operated, and their grandfathers operated before them. In addition, their methods of emplacement and laying the gun battery,
That's setting up the firing unit, then positioning the gun tubes to fire on the enemy, hadn't changed much since the 1960s. On average, it took 15 to 20 minutes to get the unit into position and set up with artillery shells and ready to fire at the enemy. By contrast, the modern United States military, using sophisticated GPS, satellite, and target acquisition systems, could set up, acquire the enemy target, fire and destroy the enemy, and leave the firing position in a fraction of that time. I was issued a Philippine military vest with body armor and a Kevlar helmet, and accompanied the unit to the field where they set up to fire a battery of 4 howitzers. Given the fact that they were issued ancient equipment and were using outdated fire procedures, the unit still performed admirably with what they had and were able to put steel on target as quickly and as accurately as was possible. The unit commander was an air assault qualified officer named Captain Kangles, who was justifiably pleased with his firing battery. From emplacement to rounds impacting on target, the unit averaged only 10 minutes. This was a remarkable feat given the equipment they had to work with. Later in the day, we returned from the field to the main base, where the unit cook served the soldiers a meal of a curry made with goat, a soup made with noodles, and a type of Vienna sausage, and a generous portion of rice. After lunch, the soldiers began the task of cleaning and doing maintenance on their howitzers. I took that time to walk around the huge concrete bay where the unit held their formations and admired the many pictures, banners, and citations that the unit had earned which decorated the walls. One picture in particular caught my eye, and I had to do a double take to ensure that what I was seeing was real. The picture was taken inside that very bay, with 6 soldiers standing side by side in front of a wall. The soldier in the middle I recognized as being Captain Kangles, although at the time the picture was taken he was a lieutenant. My cousin Juan was standing to the far right. What was shocking was that, mounted on the wall above the 6 soldiers, was a giant wing. The wing was colored dark gray, almost black, and seemed to be covered in coarse fur. The wing was withered, resembling that of a bat, only it extended beyond the 6 soldiers standing underneath it. Assuming that each of the soldiers took up 2 feet of standing space, I'd estimate that the bat-looking wing in the picture measured about 14 feet long. Not wanting to take any soldier away from their duties, I waited until later in the evening when the unit's First Sergeant Gonpalas, and several other sergeants invited me and my cousin out for dinner and drinks at the base NCO club. Over a plate of grilled steak kebabs and a nice bourbon on the rocks, I asked First Sergeant Gonpalas about the curious picture that I'd seen in the bay. To my surprise, they talked about how they acquired the wing as nonchalantly as one might describe their morning commute to work. This was the story that was related to me that night. Back when Captain Kangles was a lieutenant, the unit went out for about a week of training in one of the more remote islands in the southern part of the Philippines, where suspected insurgent fighters were said to be operating. It was a heavily forested area with several mountains and hills where almost anything could hide. The unit made a base camp in a clearing about 2 miles from the nearest village and began conducting artillery training, firing rounds into an uninhabited impact area which had previously been cut out of the dense jungle. On the 4th day of training, the village leader and several farmers came to the base camp and demanded to see Lieutenant Kangles. The village leader accused Kangles that his men had stolen several chickens and a goat from the village the night before and demanded repayment. Immediately, Lieutenant Kangles formed his unit and a thorough inspection was conducted. The unit first sergeant said that no soldier left the perimeter the previous night and no evidence was found of the missing chickens or the goat. Despite this, Lieutenant Kangles gave the villagers as much rice and canned goods as they could carry, as he didn't want any troubles with the local population, who could have been sympathetic to the rebel insurgents. However, late the next day, the village leader returned and again accused the soldiers of stealing. This time more goats and chickens were missing, with many chicken coops smashed. Lieutenant Kangles again protested the innocence of his soldiers, assuming that the village leader was just using that as an excuse to get more free food from them. However, Lieutenant Kangles agreed to send First Sergeant Gonzalez and 5 other soldiers, including my cousin Juan, to the village to investigate. The 6 soldiers, along with the village leader, were loaded on 2 military trucks and driven back to the village. Once there, the soldiers could feel a tension in the air, and the village of roughly 200 inhabitants was clearly on edge. The first sergeant radioed back to Lieutenant Kangles at the base camp that indeed many chicken coops were smashed and that the pen which held goats was also destroyed. Lieutenant Kangles radioed back, telling First Sergeant Gonzalez that the perpetrators may be rebel insurgents, that they may be trying to make the villagers hateful of the soldiers. The captain warned the soldiers to be careful and watch for any signs of insurgent movement when, all of a sudden, a scream echoed throughout the village that alerted the soldiers. A young woman crying hysterically ran from a small home and into the arms of the village leader. It took a few moments to calm the young woman down as she screamed and pointed back at her house made of bamboo and thatch. In the native language, she cried over and over again. "She's gone! She's gone! It took her!" The young woman turned out to be the village leader's daughter, and the person missing was her newborn little girl. The Filipino soldiers raced to the rear of the hut to find a huge hole torn into the back of the thatch wall where the baby was apparently sleeping. On the ground, the soldiers found evidence of claw marks. Whatever had done this had done it only a few minutes before the soldiers had arrived. First Sergeant Gonzalez radioed back to the captain, explaining the situation as well as his intention to look for the baby. Lieutenant Kangles, cautious that it may be a trap to lure the soldiers into the forest, told them to stay put until more soldiers could arrive. However, Juan heard the sounds of a baby crying somewhere in the distance, seeming to come from deep in the forest. It was getting darker by that time, with only about an hour of daylight left. First Sergeant Gonzalez again radioed the lieutenant, pleading with him to allow them to search for the infant before it became too dark. This time, Lieutenant Kangles agreed, but ordered them to remain in constant contact with the base. The soldiers plunged into the forest, trying to follow the fading sounds of the infant. Since this was only a training mission, the soldiers were armed only with 1 magazine for their rifles, containing just 5 rounds. The faint sound of a crying baby was combined with the sound of giant wings flapping, which at times seemed to go silent as if whatever was flying had settled in the trees. To their northeast were steep hills, shrouded in dense vegetation, and to the west was a wide river which flowed from north to south. For a moment, the flapping noise and the rustle of tree branches seemed to be coming from the soldiers east, meaning that whatever it was headed towards the hills. The soldiers had already been running through thick and humid jungle for about a mile, scanning the treetops and listening for noise, but after a while, the flapping noises ceased, and the jungle became quiet again. The soldiers stopped in the thick jungle, forming a perimeter, and listened. They were at the base of the hills. 3/4 of a mile to the west was the river. The soldiers were sweating and tired, having had to maneuver around the vegetation and fallen trees in their desperation to find the infant. Once again, it was Juan who heard the crying. Somewhere on the steep hill above them was the faint sound of a crying baby. As the sun crept lower and lower over the horizon, the soldiers began ascending the hill, grabbing roots, vines, and branches as they pulled themselves ever upwards. Though completely exhausted, the further up they climbed, the louder the cries of the baby were heard. They finally came to a somewhat level ground where the baby could be heard only a few dozen meters away, but they couldn't see her due to the incredibly thick vegetation. Suddenly, they were met with a sound like rushing water, when something monstrous with hideous black wings broke through the dense foliage. Juan got the best glimpse of the thing, describing it as standing roughly 5 feet tall, with a face that looked to be a combination of an old hag and a bat. The thing looked somewhat human, with female features but with legs and feet like a bat's, and it was covered in dark fur. This was the only good look that the soldiers got of the entity, as the rest of them only saw a dark shadow as it passed overhead. Climbing over a small rise, the soldiers emerged into a small clearing to a shallow cave. Around the cave were the carcasses of half-eaten raw chickens and goats. Inside the cave, in what can only be described as a nest of straw, scrap cloth and dead foliage, lay a little baby girl. Her thin clothing was ripped, and she'd suffered several scratches and appeared too tired to even cry anymore. First Sergeant Gompalis immediately scooped up the baby girl in his arms, comforting her as she coughed and whimpered. All of a sudden, shots were fired as the soldiers began firing down the hillside. First Sergeant Gompalis rushed over to see what his soldiers were shooting at. The thing was gliding downwards, away from the hill and towards the river. "If it gets across the river, we won't be able to track it again," yelled Juan. The thing sat down on top of a thick strand of trees less than a mile away, apparently injured by the shots fired from the soldiers. First Sergeant Gompalis handed the baby over to Juan, then grabbed the radio from one of the other soldiers. "Fire mission, fire mission, fire mission," he yelled back to the artillery base. "1 round, shell, high explosive, fuse, airburst." At this point, Lieutenant Kangles could have questioned First Sergeant Gompalis as to why they were firing outside of the designated impact area. He could also have questioned why they were firing an airburst, an artillery round timed to explode in the air. He did neither, trusting in the judgment of his combat-experienced First Sergeant, and ordered his unit to execute the fire mission. "Shout out," yelled Lieutenant Kagels into the radio as one M101 howitzer belched smoke and fire. Meanwhile, the thing was half walking, half crawling towards the deeper woods, flapping its wings again as if to try and fly. The soldiers up at the cave held their breath as the creature disappeared into the woods, followed by an explosion in the trees 50 feet above where the thing had vanished under the vegetation. Just as the last fading rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, a dark shape emerged from under the smoke, a scream eerily human-sounding coming from it. The black shape attempted to flap its wings as it tried to cross the river. Instead, all that could be heard was a loud splash. As soon as the soldiers returned to the village, they quickly brought the baby girl back to the base camp, along with the village leader and the greatly relieved mother. The medics examined the baby girl and cleaned and bandaged her wounds. Despite being a bit dehydrated and scratched and bruised, the baby girl would make a full recovery. Lieutenant Kangles filed a report with the battalion command and assigned a squad of soldiers to watch over the village for a few days, but nothing more unusual occurred. Over the course of the next training period, soldiers returned to the village to help repair the damage to the chicken coops and the pens which held the goats. They also repaired the home of the baby girl, whom the soldiers nicknamed Lucky Star. The display of artillery gunnery by First Sergeant Gompalis was nothing short of spectacular, as hitting a moving target with just 1 round was amazing. 3 days later, fishermen fishing the river found the wing washed up on the shore and brought it to the soldiers. The soldiers eventually brought the wing back to base and mounted it on the wall. The thing started to shrivel up and stink as it was exposed to constant daylight. So, a day and a half later, the soldiers took it down and burned it. And that was that. Still, the nonchalant way they described the incident fascinated me, as if this was just one aspect of life being a soldier in that part of the world. For their part, the Filipino soldiers were just as fascinated by my apparently nonchalant description of being surrounded by thousands of terrorist insurgents when I was on an isolated base in Iraq only a few months earlier. We Americans faced ISIS fighters, and the Filipino soldiers faced big, creepy Batwoman monsters. No big deal either way when you've got an artillery on your side. Unknown contact over the Tonkin Gulf. My heroes have always been those brave men and women who've actually gone out and been there and done that, and who overcame incredible odds to inspire the world. The young Jewish girl who hid with her family in an attic in Amsterdam and wrote in her diary about the horrors of Nazi socialist oppression before she was found and killed. the frightened young American soldier who climbed atop a burning American tank destroyer and single-handedly fought against an assault force of Hitler's best soldiers. The bold African-American doctor who gave his life in pursuit of his dream of racial equality in America. Those courageous first responders who gave their lives to save innocent lives during the 9/11 attacks. The little Afghan girl who was shot in the head by the Taliban because she wanted to go to school and survived to become a champion of the right of those little girls to go to school. These people are my heroes, not the grotesquely overpaid athletes who chase balls around a sports field, or the Hollywood action stars who make millions of dollars shooting hundreds of bad guys in their movies, then preach to us about gun control. I know an elderly gentleman who comes into our local watering hole every once in a while and orders exactly 3 mugs of beer before he leaves. Although he's in his late 70s and hunched over with age, he is still rather tall and imposing. Despite his imposing size, he's quiet and reserved, never raises his voice, and is, in every respect, quite unremarkable. Then, one Saturday evening, this elderly, soft-spoken man came into the bar wearing a green t-shirt, bearing the screen-printed image of a US Navy F-8 Crusader fighter jet. The big US Navy airshow was going on that weekend at Naval Air Station Oceana, showcasing the US Navy and US Air Force's latest and most modern fighter jets and attack bombers. The Navy was celebrating 100 years of naval aviation, and vendors were selling t-shirts with images of various historical and modern US Navy fighter planes. The Crusader was the US Navy's first supersonic jet and was designed to be an air superiority fighter used to defend the naval fleet against enemy fighters. The F-8 Crusader fighter served as the US Navy's primary air superiority fighter during the Cold War, and squadrons of F-8 Crusaders were extensively deployed with the US Navy and US Marines during the Vietnam War, where their kill record against the most advanced enemy communist fighters could not be matched. Though we have many advanced fighter aircraft, such as the Air Force F-22 Raptor and the Navy F-18 Super Hornet, my all-time favorite jet fighter is the F-8 Crusader, which was designed in the late 1950s. I took a seat next to the elderly gentleman and passed him a mug of beer, telling him that I really liked his shirt with the image of the F-8 Crusader. He smiled as he accepted the beer which I'd bought for him, surprised that someone as young as I would recognize the old fighter jet. "Yep," he said. "It's been a while since I strapped into the old Crusader. I was a gunslinger," the slang term for an F-8 Crusader fighter pilot, from 1962 to 1972, and did a few tours of Vietnam. I usually don't splurge on myself, so my wife bought this for me at the air show today. Whoa, I thought. Did this gentleman just say he piloted my favorite fighter jet of all time during an active wartime situation? I smiled, feeling truly honored to be in the presence of one of America's wartime heroes. "Everyone knows you as Bud," I said. "But what's your real name, sir?" Sarge," he said. "Bud was my old call sign." When Bud told me his real name, I paused. That name sounded familiar, but I really couldn't place it. Later that evening, I looked up his name on the internet and was pleasantly surprised and shocked. The old, unassuming, quiet gentleman that everyone only knew as Bud was not only an F-8 Crusader fighter pilot who served in Vietnam, he was also a MiG killer. In 1967, while on a mission somewhere over North Vietnam, he was attacked by communist enemy MiG-17 jet fighters. At that time, the MiG-17 fighter was the absolute very best dogfighter that the communists had, and 4 of them attacked Bud. He held them off, flying with extreme skill, and managed to blow one of the enemy fighters out of the sky using 2 Sidewinder air-to-air missiles. The rest of the enemy MiG-17s fled the area as quickly as possible, fearful of falling to Bud's Sidewinder missiles or his 20mm cannons. Now, one of my favorite quiet-time hobbies is putting together and painting plastic model kits of various different fighter jets and armored vehicles. It was a relaxing hobby that I picked up when bad memories of Iraq and Afghanistan haunted me at night. I bought a plastic model kit of an F-8 Crusader fighter, which I built and then painted. To top it off, I found the distinctive squadron markings and aircraft identifiers of Bud's F-8 Crusader, and essentially built a small-scale version of the actual fighter that he flew during the Vietnam War. Finally, I mounted the model jet on a wooden plaque, which I'd painted to look like the deck of the carrier that Bud had flown from. The next time I saw Bud at the bar, I presented him with his gift, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw the old war hero smile. "Is that my squadron?" he said, placing the model carefully on the bar and looking over every detail of the fighter. "Look at the tail number, sir," I said. "That is your fighter." Bud pulled a pair of spectacles from his pocket and looked at the tail number, clapping his hands. "That was my tail number." He then looked at the number painted on the simulated deck of the aircraft carrier. Number 31. The USS Bonhomme Richard." He sat for several seconds, smiling and nodding, memories of his service coming back to him. "Thank you for this, Sarge," he said. "You are more than welcome, my friend," I responded. "Thank you for your service." "So, your hobby is model kits," Bud said. "After my time in war, my stress relief was painting. I had to stop after a few years after my eyesight started to get bad. You know that guy Bob Ross also took up painting after his tour in Vietnam?" "I did not know that," I said. God, he seemed so calm and gentle that I could watch him for hours painting those almighty trees on his show, The Joy of Painting. Bud laughed. In the military, Bob Ross was a real hard-ass. He was the mean senior sergeant who yelled a lot and punished guys who showed up late for work. When he left the military after serving 20 years, Bob Ross promised never to yell again and took up painting. Well, the rest, as they say, is history. "That's an incredible story, Bud," I answered. "Well, I'd love to see some of your work someday." "Sure, Sarge," Bud answered. "But if you have any other models, I'd really like to see them. I've always wanted to go into building models, but my fingers are just too big to do any good detail work." Well, in fact, I'd converted my garage into a man cave with wall-to-wall shelves of displays of military tanks and aircraft of every type and era. In addition, I had 80 different fighter aircraft hanging down and lining the tops of the wall. Other shelves contained historical books and references of military history and military equipment. In the middle of the floor were 2 overstuffed couches facing my large flat-screen television and racks of military-themed movies. And, of course, in the corner was a fully stocked minibar that I had inherited from my father. My man cave was a virtual museum of American military history. I handed Bud a chilled pint of beer as I walked him into my man cave. He stopped at every diorama, studying each detail of every model, including models of US M1 tanks, M60 tanks, and even the Vietnam-era M48 tank, the F-4 Phantom II fighters, F-100 Super Sabre fighters, the World War II-era P-40 Warhawk fighters, and many, many more. "This is almost overwhelming," Bud said, sitting down on one of the couches. "You can't take it all in at once." "Well, you're welcome any time, Bud," I smiled. Said Bud, looking over at a display shelf on the far corner. On it I had displays of science fiction models like Star Wars, Battlestar Galactica, Japanese anime, and models of the science fiction movies which were popular in the 50s and 60s. Bud stood up and walked to the shelf. "I haven't seen that in decades," he said. Curious, I followed Bud to the shelf. Bud pointed to a diorama on the science fiction shelf. "That's a plastic model I built of the supposed UFO that crash-landed in Roswell," I said, thinking that Bud meant he saw an old 50s black and white science fiction movie that might have featured a UFO that looked like this. "Yep," Bud said. It's pretty accurate, but the one I saw didn't have the big saucer-shaped transparent top. Still, it's pretty accurate. I'm not sure what you mean, Bud, I said as I refreshed his pint of beer. You actually saw this aircraft? Bud nodded, still staring at the model of the UFO before walking back to the couch. Yeah. It was a long time ago, but I still remember. That there is actually a model of what we saw. It makes me think that me and Boulder really did see what we saw. I poured myself a bourbon on the rocks and sat on the opposite couch. Oh, please don't leave me hanging, Bud. Did you also shoot down a UFO in Vietnam? Bud chuckled and sipped his beer. Do you really want to know? Of course, I said. Bud looked straight forward, as if his mind was traveling back in time. Towards the end of 1967, our tour of duty on the bomb-armed Richard was coming to a close. We conducted an airstrike against communist military facilities at Haiphong Harbor, near Hanoi, and one of our A-4 Skyhawk strike fighters was shot down by a North Vietnamese surface-to-air missile. The A-4 Skyhawk pilot was ejected and landed in an open rice paddy. It was a race between our search and rescue guys and the communist militia to see who got to him first. We had 2 A-1 Sandys, slow-moving, propeller-driven fighters, and one Jolly Green Giant helicopter flying towards our downed pilot to pick him up. I was flying top cover with my wingman, Walter, over the rescue teams, to protect them from the enemy MiGs. The pilot on the ground was hunkered down behind a paddy filled with muddy water and reported that the communists had in place several machine gun positions inside the tree line of a hill several hundred meters away. He was taking fire from that enemy position. The 2 Sandys and the Jolly Green Giant were still several minutes away, so I led Boulder into a steep dive towards the enemy gun emplacements. The F-8 Crusader wasn't optimized as a bomber. It was a fighter, but we were still armed with 2,000-pound bombs. We came in low, flying over our downed pilot and towards the enemy, and released our ordnance on the target. We pulled up as 4 massive explosions burst in the jungle behind us. We looped round and orbited over our downed pilot as he reported that the enemy positions had gone silent. But there were still more communists approaching his position. We stayed on site for several more minutes, but having expended our bombs, we only had our guns and air-to-air missiles, which were not very effective in hitting ground targets. Soon, however, the Sandys and the Jolly Green Giant arrived on site. I was almost bingo fuel, so I was ordered to return to the ship as 2 F-4 Phantom II fighters from the carrier Kitty Hawk took our spot as fighter air cover. Boulder and I were cruising at 20,000 feet, headed southeast, and went feet wet over the Gulf of Tonkin towards our ship, when we were suddenly vectored to change course due north towards an unidentified aerial contact traveling at high speed towards our fleet, at around 40,000 feet. We changed course and headed towards the unidentified contact, thinking that the communists were extremely foolish to attempt to hit our ships with just a single aircraft. We opened throttle and rapidly gained altitude to meet the unidentified craft head-on. Our Crusaders entered a cloud bank, and when we popped out of the clouds, there it was, a silvery metallic saucer-shaped object, about a mile to our 12 o'clock high. The object was approaching the fleet at high speed, but when we saw it, it suddenly stopped in midair and just hovered. Boulder was flying a half-mile off my left wing, and the object was between us as we zipped past it. That object was definitely solid, and definitely wasn't anything the Americans had in our infantry. It was about 100 feet in diameter. The top half of the saucer was convex, and had what looked like small rectangular portholes around the perimeter of the craft. The bottom of the saucer was relatively flat, with a small circular protrusion extending below it. It seemed to glow slightly, but I wasn't sure if it was self-generated or if its metallic surface was reflecting the sun. Boulder and I banked sharply and dived back down to get a better look at the thing. Well, to our amazement, the craft simply dropped straight down to 20,000 feet in a matter of seconds. We dived in a turning loop in an attempt to get behind the thing, and broke through the clouds again. We caught up with the craft, which was several miles ahead of us, and was still approaching the fleet again. I tried tracking it with my Sidewinder missiles, but the craft would make these impossible moves which no human could survive. In 1 second, it would be directly in front of us, but once our Sidewinders would start tracking, the craft would seem to jump a half-mile left or right up, making it impossible for us to get a shot. Well, by this time, we'd close to where we could get a gunshot with our 20mm cannon. You might be able to throw off a missile, but you couldn't fool bullets. I was closing to 1 mile of the craft with Boulder still to my left, when the craft zoomed 90 degrees to the right, and in a second was at least 10 miles away before shooting straight up into the clouds. Boulder and I landed on the Bonnie, little more than fumes in our fuel tanks, and we quickly made our report to the CNC about our contact with the unknown craft, describing every detail we could about it. However, our main concern was for our downed American pilot still trapped inside North Vietnam. About an hour later, we learned that our pilot was extracted from that rice paddy and was on his way to Da Nang with a bullet in the leg. He was wounded but would survive, although the Jolly Green Giant that pulled him out was shot up pretty bad. The 2 Sandys that were covering them also suffered damage from enemy ground fire. About a month later, Boulder and I were told that the aircraft we encountered was most likely the Soviet Union's newest high-speed fighter, the MiG-25 Foxbat, an aircraft which, as it turns out, looks absolutely nothing like the aircraft I saw. But the U.S. Navy Crusader fighter pilot and American war hero peacefully passed away a few months later in his sleep, surrounded by family, friends, and loved ones. I was also happy to see that a few former F-8 Crusader pilots were at his funeral, and the one thing that they could say about Bud, besides him being an awesome fighter pilot, was that he was the consummate practical joker. He could carry on a joke story for days. Well, I was tempted to ask them about Bud's UFO encounter, but decided against it. If he was having a laugh pulling my leg, then more power to him. I pray your war has ended. Every time I return from a deployment, I don't stay home for very long. I stay home just long enough to drop off my gear, say my hellos to friends and family, and then I have to leave again for about a month. Usually I'll fly to Germany, Hanover in particular, to blow off steam and decompress. Anyone who says that they've returned from serving in Iraq or Afghanistan and claims they don't need to blow off steam and decompress has never served in Iraq or Afghanistan. After my last tour of duty in Iraq, however, I decided to change things up a bit. Instead of flying to Hanover, I decided to take a trip to my family's native country of the Philippines. I don't know why. I guess it was just something different to do. My mother's family comes from a place in the northern Philippine island of Luzon called Baguio City. Those who have never been there, Baguio is a remarkable place. It's a city built high in the mountains, and only 4 roads lead to and from the sprawling city, although during typhoon season, only 2 roads lead to and from it, as the other 2 roads usually get washed out. Starting from sea level, it usually takes between 40 minutes to an hour to drive the narrow roads that oftentimes double back on themselves as each snakes around steep gorges, lush green rice terraces, in order to reach the city in the mountains. Amazingly, entire communities and villages are built into the sides of the mountain with houses, shops, and farms literally constructed on top of each other. There's almost no flat place in Baguio City. A tourist will find that they are either walking up a crowded street or they're walking down a crowded street. The giant SM Mall, located in the bustling shopping district, is also unique in that you can walk in it at the ground floor, go up 3 stories, and step off on the ground floor as the mall is built into the side of a mountain. Narrow streets jam-packed with buses, taxis, jeepneys, and scooters go every which way in the city, leading up and down and around the various schools, restaurants, parks, and markets. Being so high in the mountains, the city of Baguio always enjoys relatively pleasant temperatures all year round, and when the rest of the Philippines is baking in the tropical heat of the summer, the moderate temperatures in Baguio has earned it the unofficial title of the Philippines' summer capital. But it also has its drawbacks as well, as almost every day during the afternoon between 2 p.m. and 6 p.m., a visitor can expect it to rain. During typhoon season, the rains could last for days and days on end, leaving everything from the hardwood floors to the towels in your closet feeling cold and moist. My mother's family owns a rather tall house atop the tallest hill which overlooks the city. Her 3-story, 9-bedroom home is built literally on the side of a cliff, with a narrow road running down the small driveway. Again, in this community, homes were built so close together that your next-door neighbor to your left could be in a house situated on ground 10 feet above your house, while your neighbor to the right could be situated on ground 20 feet below you. On the top floor of my mother's home is a balcony, which gives one a breathtaking view of the entire city and surrounding countryside, as well as the home of our neighbors, who live on a narrow cross street at least 100 feet below us. I don't stand out on the balcony for long periods of time because I'm scared of heights and tend to get a touch of vertigo if I look out at the panorama for too long. And so it was at my mother's home on top of this hill, on top of this mountain, where I found myself after my last tour of Iraq, and boy did I need to decompress. Being trapped and surrounded by 12,000 screaming ISIS fighters and constantly being rocketed every day was no picnic. I had been napping in one of the upstairs bedrooms for most of the afternoon. It started raining at around 3 p.m. and didn't start to peter off until around 7. I was feeling restless and closed in since there wasn't any reliable internet and there wasn't much in the way of channels to watch on television, as if I could understand what they were saying anyway. I was all alone in this big house with nothing to do. So I threw on a pair of jeans and a black t-shirt that I bought from the PX at Camp Arjifan in Kuwait and stepped outside. To get to the street, you had to walk down a narrow flight of stone steps, then get on the second landing, and walk down another flight of narrow stone steps which wound its way down to the driveway. There was a bright red metal gate which enclosed the driveway and opened directly into the narrow street in front of the house. Once outside the gate, I turned left to where the road literally drops another 50 feet to another road below. The angle of the road is so steep that vehicles don't so much drive down this road as fall to the street below. Well, like I said earlier, the houses, shops, and little stores on this hill were built very close to one another, and as it had turned out to be a clear and pleasant evening, I'd expected to see more people running about. But aside from a few stray cats and dogs and the occasional crowing of a family rooster, I appeared to be alone on the well-lit cobblestone streets. At the base of the hill was another crowded and bustling street. During the daytime it was filled with automotive shops, marketplaces, restaurants, and places to purchase farming tools and equipment. However, at night, as if by magic, this is all replaced by lounges, karaoke bars, gentlemen's clubs, and places where people can dance and mingle. Feeling in the mood for a nice bourbon and live music, I decided to walk the mile and some change down the hill to one of the nicer lounges at the base. As I said, the streets were rather narrow, and the sidewalks, where there were sidewalks, were only about 2 feet wide. It was unusually quiet, and the air was still as I began walking down one of the narrow streets which led down to the main road, leading down the hill. I was enjoying the peace and tranquility of it all, and the fact that I didn't have to worry about incoming rocket attacks. I looked around and marveled at how everything here seemed to look like it was frozen in time, and that everything looked exactly like it did when it was first built back before World War II. With the constant rains, lichen, moss, flowers, and vines grew out of the stone retaining walls which lined the streets, as if they were a lost city somewhere deep in the Amazon rainforest. I was lost in thought and didn't even recognize that I was now at a portion of the road where the streetlights were getting dim. It soon began to get misty, the results of the moist night air mixing with the warmer temperatures, and soon I couldn't see where I was stepping. I eventually came to a point where the winding road intersected with another main road. Well, I wasn't lost, but I also didn't quite know exactly where I was. I knew, however, that if I kept taking the road that went down, I was going in the right direction. I chose the road going to the right, which seemed to lead down off the hill, so I followed it for a few minutes. Soon a couple of taxicabs appeared out of the mist and passed me going up the hill, so I knew that I was on the right track. I soon passed a beauty salon which was on the ground floor of a tall hotel called the Mountainside Inn. I seem to recall that the lounge that I wanted to visit was behind this establishment, but further down the base of the hill. A very narrow side street led off the mountain road towards the direction of the lounge, but it was shrouded in darkness. Well, I could either continue on the main road, which would eventually lead to the street at the base of the hill, and then turn right and walk towards the lounge, or I could see if this dark, narrow street was actually a shortcut. I decided to go down the dark and narrow street to see where it led, because I was an American soldier, fresh from war, vacationing in a foreign land where I barely recognized any landmarks. So, yeah, no common sense. I walked in the middle of the street because the mist and fog were now all around me. I didn't want to step into a ditch or open drain, which I knew lined the streets. The road wound down between the Mountainside Inn on the right and a low stone wall to my left, and led downward, so I knew I was still going in the right direction. Instead of turning left towards the main road at the base of the hill like I'd expected, the road went right, doubling back on itself and winding back up the hill. The houses next to me were pitch black, and there were no working streetlights here, as the mist seemed to swallow me in its embrace. Well, I thought about doubling back and walking to the main road, but, well, I wasn't in a hurry, really. Plus, this walk was kind of cool. In fact, it was getting cooler by the second. It was downright chilly. Just as I had the feeling that I wasn't alone on this dark stretch of road, an icy chill ran up my spine. I could just barely see my shadow in front of me from a faint glow to my back. Thinking that a car was approaching behind me, I turned around to see a young lady in a white dress standing about 10 feet from me. At first, I thought that the reason I could see her was because of the light from the moon, but I soon realized that she was the one who was actually glowing. I thought. That's cool. I stared at her for a second. The air around her seemed to shimmer ever so slightly, so I couldn't see her in any exact detail. However, from the expression on her face, I could tell that this young lady was not happy to see me. With my knowledge of the traditional Filipino language somewhere between none and zero, I did the only thing that I could do. "Hi," I said in English. The glowing young lady with the angry expression said nothing, but in my head I could hear Japanese. What? I said. How did you do that? You are a soldier. You are Japanese, came the angry voice in my head in an accusing tone. You are a Japanese soldier. Yeah, but I'm only about a quarter Japanese. I'm mostly Filipino, and a little Spanish and Chinese if my mom's to be believed. Well, Grandma got around a lot, I guess. You are a Japanese soldier, she screamed in my head. You do not belong here. This is our land. Somewhere in her rage I could also hear desperation and sadness. During the Japanese invasion of the Philippines in World War II, the Japanese had done some unspeakably cruel and violent things to the Filipino people. The Filipinos were subhuman in the eyes of the Japanese, and the Japanese soldiers often took pleasure in tossing Filipino babies into the air so they could try to impale them with their bayonets. In fact, the reason why I'm part Japanese was because a Japanese soldier had gotten my grandmother pregnant. My mother had told me stories of a young lady in a white dress that was savagely raped and brutally murdered by the Japanese. Her ghost was said to haunt these hills, guiding innocent travelers who may have gotten lost, and frightening evil men who had wicked intentions. I'm not afraid of you, miss. I'm not an evil man, and I have no wicked intentions. Japanese soldier, she hissed. Yes, I admitted. I am part Japanese, and yes, I am a soldier, but I'm an American soldier. I paused, wondering if she'd say anything. Well, she just stared at me, as if waiting. We fought side by side with you. We suffered with you. We bled and we died with you. And together we were defeated by the Japanese with you. But, well, the promise was fulfilled. We returned again, and we threw out the Japanese soldiers. This land belongs to the Filipino people. I'm sorry for what happened to you, but I am not your enemy. I am an American soldier. The young lady regarded me for a second, then slowly turned away, seeming to take the mist with her. The air grew warmer, and the streetlights flickered on as she slowly vanished. Go with God, I said as she finally faded from view. In my head, I heard one last word. Salamat. Later on, I was relaxing and enjoying a nice bourbon on the rocks at the crowded Miles Club. I asked the friendly bartender what the word salamat means. Wait, he laughed. You're Filipino and you don't know what salamat means. Humor me, I said. Salamat, said the bartender, is Filipino for thank you. What is killing all these soldiers? Every American military unit that deploys to serve overseas has its fair share of good NCO leadership. It's a non-commissioned officer, a sergeant. And almost every unit has that one NCO who stands out to be the very best. This NCO is the person who's extremely competent and confident, a generous mentor to the people that he leads, a loyal supporter to his NCO peers, and the invaluable advisor to the officer in charge. This one particular outstanding NCO was the go-to person when other NCOs needed information or advice, and in our particular case, the outstanding NCO in our unit was my friend, a sergeant first class named Tommy. Tommy and I were sitting on a long, comfortable wooden bench in front of the barracks and relaxing after a particularly long day of patrolling. We were back on a long elevated wooden deck which ran down the entire length of the barracks, and we rested our feet up on the wooden railing which bordered the deck. The setting sun cast the sky in brilliant and fiery shades of reds and oranges and purples as it sank behind the mighty mountain peak known to us Americans simply as Big Duke. We were serving as NATO peacekeepers and were stationed at the main American operating base called Camp Bondsteel in Kosovo. The summer was coming to an end, and with it our year-long deployment was also coming to a close. The weather was pleasant, and the colours in the sky, mixed with the high clouds, painted a breathtaking picture from our vantage point on the hilltop. Tommy pulled the pipe from his lips. "Oh, I'm really going to miss that view," he said, leaning back on the bench and exhaling. I nodded in agreement. We have to come back to Kosovo someday, but not as peacekeepers, but as visitors. We did so much good here. I want to see if it lasts. We stared at big old Mount Duke for a while, and I said, "Okay, explain to me the difference between a .223 ball ammunition round and a .556 ball ammunition round again. Aren't they the same?" Well, I knew that Tommy liked talking about everything guns, weapons, and ammunition. In fact, he was once an army sniper. I needed to get him talking about something so that I could ask him the question that I really wanted to ask him. Well, Tommy smiled as he took another puff from his pipe. The .223 and the .556 round are visually similar. The difference is in the grain used to propel the rounds. The .223 is optimized for the civilian market, while the .556 is strictly used for the military. Our M4 and M16 rifles can fire both kinds of ammunition, but in the civilian version of our rifles, you should only fire the .223 round. I nodded. You learn something new every day. Well, at least I got him to start talking. Now I have a question for you, said Tommy. Why do the Russians have 61mm and 82mm mortars? Because the Russians are sneaky bastards, I said. Americans have 60mm mortars and 81mm mortars. If we capture Russian mortar rounds, we can't use them because they're exactly 1mm bigger than our mortar tubes. But if Russians capture ours, they can use them against us. I've trained you well, my young Jedi, said Tommy, and we both had a good laugh. Great, now, maybe I can get to talk about what I really wanted him to talk about. Hey, Tom, I said. Is everything okay? I mean, are you going to be okay? So there it was. I'd said it. Ours was a very close-knit unit, and bad news travelled fast. A few weeks ago, Sergeant First Class Tommy received a letter from his wife back home. She'd been cheating on him while he was away, and had cleared out their bank account. She also threatened to divorce him and take away his 2 daughters and his house, as well as half of his retirement pay. Tommy, who for the past year had served his country, his battalion, and his friends with courage and honor, would be going home completely broke. Tommy took a long puff of his pipe and exhaled slowly, watching the smoke dissipate. He smiled. Ah, brother, he said. An hour ago all of my earthly problems went away. Huh? I said. I turned to Tommy, wondering what he meant. I was about to ask him what he was talking about when Tommy interrupted me. Let me ask you this, brother, said Tommy. Are you going to be okay? Getting a video call on Skype from your new wife telling you that she's been cheating on you has to be tough. Believe me, I know. What? What did Tommy know? An hour ago, after I'd submitted my daily patrol report to my team commander, I went back to my living quarters to talk to my wife on Skype. At 23 years old, she was 10 years younger than me. We were only married 2 weeks before I left for Kosovo, so we really didn't have time for a proper honeymoon. Well, I'd saved enough money during my deployment for us to have an awesome honeymoon in Europe, which would culminate in a trip to Ohio to visit her lifelong friend who she'd grown up with. She was usually happy to talk with me, but today she looked depressed and near tears. What's wrong, baby? I'd asked. You okay, sweetheart? Yes, she cried. But you won't be. As it turns out, almost since the day I left, she'd been cheating on me with her lifelong friend and was now planning to move in with him and eventually marry him. They just needed money. Money which I unknowingly provided to them every time I sent my paycheck home to my wife. I stood up and stepped towards the railing. How did Tommy find out so fast? Well, I knew bad news really travelled quick in our unit, but this was ridiculous. I looked off into the distance, admiring the view. Damn, I was going to miss that beautiful sight of the sun setting behind Big Duke. I'll be fine, brother, I said. Are you sure? Said Tommy from behind me. I don't want you to do anything, well, you know. Yep, I knew. Suicide takes more American soldiers' lives than enemy bullets. Trust me, I said. I love my wife, but I love my life as well. She isn't worth me hurting myself. Oh, I'm so glad to hear that, brother, said Tommy. I just needed to make sure before I go. I turned around. What did he mean by that? An empty bench stared back at me. All of a sudden, I heard the wailing of sirens coming from the barracks row behind me. Emergency vehicles and medic Humvees were turning the corner as soldiers ran from their barracks rooms. I jumped the rail and ran around my barracks towards the sound of the sirens. They gathered in front of Sergeant First Class Tommy's barracks room, and about 20 soldiers were crowded outside. A squad of MPs were pushing us back, keeping us from the door. What's going on? I yelled. A young female specialist from Tommy's team, tears in her eyes and crying inconsolably, said, It's Sergeant Tommy. He shot himself with his own sidearm. They found divorce papers next to his body. What? I said. But I was just... No, damn it. Damn it. Damn it! Well, even after he died, Tommy was concerned about his friends. Even in death, he wanted to make sure that his friends would make it home safely. Later on, at least 3 other soldiers claimed to see Sergeant First Class Tommy. He was checking on them, giving them advice, and encouraging them to continue to be great leaders of our young soldiers. If you're sitting there safe and sound, and sleeping around with everyone and their brother while your soldier is overseas serving his nation, then you are the one who's killing us. Every time a soldier leaves the wire to go on patrol, he risks his life. He needs to focus on the mission in order to survive. If he has to worry about what's going on back home, he loses focus and he may die. It's worse when he's back in the rear and he has time to think about how he's thousands of miles away while you're destroying your relationship. I tell you the truth. The biggest killers of the deployed American soldier are your damn Dear John letters. Tommy was the best of us, and we miss you, brother. A prayer before dying. A few years ago, I was a staff sergeant serving as the battle captain on an isolated base in the western province of Herat in Afghanistan. As a battle captain, I was in charge of the base security and defenses, and as such I had several assets with which to conduct base security operations. We usually had 2 American up-armored Humvees armed with M240B machine guns, and 1 MATV MARP mounting a 50 cal heavy machine gun patrolling the 4-mile perimeter of the base at any given time. I volunteered to take the night shift from 1800 hours in the evening to 0700 in the morning, as the evening hours were when the excitement usually happened. We also had 25 guard towers surrounding the perimeter of the base, which we also had to keep an eye on. They were manned by Afghan soldiers, and the Afghan National Army wasn't particularly attentive or competent or even friendly at times. They sometimes seemed more of a danger to themselves than the enemy, as they often accidentally fired their weapons inside their guard towers, injuring themselves or their fellow soldiers. Other times they would shine signal lights into the villages a mile or 2 outside of the base, to be answered by signal lights shining back towards the base, a telltale sign that we had enemy insurgents wearing ANA uniforms. Oftentimes, I'd take a Humvee with lights shut off and position myself to observe portions of the perimeter to see if I could catch insurgent signal communications from the base. We also had aerial surveillance assets in the form of predator drones from the nearby Special Forces camp. We operated out of a small, 1-story building called the Joint Defense Operations Center, or JDOC, which was located in the Afghan National Army part of the base. A brief description of the base may be in order. The base used to be one of the largest airfields built by the Soviets during their invasion of Afghanistan decades earlier. The majority of the base was occupied by the Afghan army and was used as a basic training center for new recruit soldiers. A motorized battalion of Italian soldiers also shared the base with us, the Italians using the HESCO barriers to build a virtual castle around their portion of the base. The Italian perimeter had HESCO barriers rising as high as 15 to 20 feet, complete with built-in fighting positions. We Americans held an inner portion of the base, surrounded by HESCO barriers which stood 8 to 10 feet tall. We controlled the airfield and conducted all air operations. Like I said, the base was very isolated. In fact, we were closer to Iran than we were to the nearest friendly operational base in Afghanistan. The main instrument we used for nighttime surveillance was called a raid camera, or the eye in the sky. It was a highly sensitive camera which could see miles and miles around the base, through most weather conditions, including through a sandstorm. The camera was secured on a rotating turret and mounted on a pole that stood 2 stories above the ground. The system was in place behind the JDOC and monitored 24/7 by American civilian contractors. Enemy forces who believed that the night kept them hidden never realized that we could see them as if it was full daylight. Well, it was midnight on a chilly November evening with the skies clear and bright with stars. It was a strangely peaceful and beautiful night. The Taliban hadn't lobbed a rocket at us in days. On nights like this, I love going outside of the JDOC and climb the low mound of dirt surrounding the building and just look up at the stars. There was absolutely no light pollution here, and the galaxy seemed to open up like a universe-sized stage of innumerable stars and galaxies. I stood there for only a short while, when the door to the J-Dock opened and light poured out. "Sergeant, I think you need to see this." It was my friend, the tall, skinny civilian contractor monitoring a raid camera. I followed him back inside and walked to the raid camera monitor. "What you got, Roy?" I asked the young man. "Take a look at this," he said. I was scanning the village about 2 clicks to the north. The Italians are conducting recon in the area, and I caught this. On the screen, a clean-shaven young man dressed in white robes was kneeling next to a low stone wall. He was rocking back and forth, as if he were praying. "Late-night prayers?" I asked. "Maybe," answered Roy, "but he's not facing the right way. Also, I caught him on the thermal sight. If I go to IR sites, there's nothing there." Roy switched to the various other night vision options available on the camera, but the strange apparition only appeared on thermal sights. "It could be a malfunction?" I asked. "Possibly," answered Roy, "but I did a diagnostic test earlier this evening. Everything checks out." All of a sudden, a force, some unseen force, came down on the young man's neck and severed his head. The head bounced off the low wall and rolled a short distance from the body, which had slumped to the ground. Roy cursed and panned back for a wider angle, but there was no one around the now dead young man. I got on the radio and called the American Tactical Operations Center, or TOC, to see if we had anything in the air over the village like an Apache or a Predator. Unfortunately, we didn't have anything up that night. However, the TOC informed me that an Italian dismounted patrol is not very far away. Roy picked up the Italians on the raid camera about half a kilometer from the wall, and I directed them into a skirmish line which would allow them to catch anyone who committed the murder. The Italian platoon maneuvered professionally and with great skill as they approached the low wall surrounding the village and fanned out to catch any insurgents trying to escape. But they encountered no one either entering or leaving the village. And soon they were at the exact spot where the body lay. "Negative contact," said the Italian lieutenant. "Your people are right there," I answered. "Do you see the body?" "Negative," came the reply from the Italian platoon leader. "There is no body here." "You're less than 10 feet from the body," I said. "Your radio operator is practically standing over it." "I am sorry," answered the lieutenant, "but we see no one here." "Sergeant," said Roy, "take a look at this." Roy pointed back towards the monitor. The body of the murdered young man had disappeared. While they did not see a body, the lieutenant and his radio man admitted to feeling a numbing cold in the area where the young man was apparently murdered. Well, I called off the search, and the Italian platoon returned to base shortly afterwards. But later in the morning, when the sun crept over the mountains, the Italian lieutenant brought his platoon back to the village and met with the village elder. The lieutenant came to the J-Dot later in the day and told me what had transpired. When the lieutenant met the village leader, the elderly Afghan man said that the young man we'd seen being murdered was his son. Before we came and drove off the Taliban had come to the village and executed the village leader's son as a warning. I apologized to the Italian lieutenant for sending his platoon on a wild goose chase, but the lieutenant just laughed it off. "This valley is full of ghosts, my friend," he said. "Believe me, I know." Oftentimes, on clear evenings between midnight and 0200, we could see that young man on the raid camera getting executed over and over again. After a while, Roy just stopped scanning that sector, and I was okay with that. Bambi and Thumper versus the Big Bad Wolf. Does anyone remember watching one of the final scenes of the Lord of the Rings trilogy where Frodo and his fellow hobbits, Samwise, Matthew and Perry, I'm not sure about those last two, well, they're just sitting at a table in the middle of the festivities. All of the other hobbits were celebrating the near impossible victory over the forces of evil, while Frodo and his buddies were just sitting there, stunned and shocked that they were still alive. This short scene that only lasts a few seconds is my favourite scene of the whole trilogy because that one scene shows exactly what happens when soldiers return from a year of war. We would oftentimes meet at a drinking establishment and sit in stunned silence, amazed that we were still alive after all of the horrors we'd experienced. This was the case not too long ago when I was with a few buddies. We were sitting in an unmanned gentleman's club out in the middle of the El Paso desert. Weird as it may sound, after coming home from a year of serving in the Middle East, we felt comfortable in that lonely, out-of-the-way drinking establishment out in the South Texas desert. This is not my story, but the story of my buddy, Eduardo. My name is Eduardo Acosta Bambino, and I was born in Costa Rica. When I was 10, my family immigrated to the United States, legally of course, and moved to northern New York State, where my father worked one full-time job and 2 part-time jobs to support the family. My mother was going to school to become a nurse, so that's why my father was working so hard. He didn't want my mother to have to get a part-time job so that she could concentrate on becoming a nurse. Well, I helped out as well, getting my 6-year-old sister ready for school in the morning and picking her up in the evenings once I was done with the school day. We were renting a modest 3-bedroom, 2-story house within walking distance of the hospital where my mother was working as an intern. My father drove to and from his many jobs in an old red and rust-colored Dodge pickup truck. Looking back at the time, we were by no means wealthy, but we were happy and we never lacked for food, family support, and love. One thing about our family was that we all felt immensely privileged and blessed to be Americans and living in the greatest country in the world. My father always said that we would not take one dime of government assistance or support, as receiving supposedly free things from the government actually enslaved you to the government. We'd seen it all too often in South America. What the government gives, the government will take away, leaving you no choice but to think, act, and vote the way that the government wants. We saw that mentality here in America as well, but like I said, my father was determined that our family would be a success without any government handouts. America was the land of opportunity, but success wasn't an entitlement. Success was there for those willing to put hard work in and apply their God-given gifts and talents. And that's exactly what my family did for many years. Now, flash forward 8 years and my family was able to move to the suburbs and was even able to purchase a bigger house. My mother was now a full-fledged nurse at the hospital where she worked caring for newborn babies and infants. My father was able to purchase the grocery store which he'd worked at for so many years from the kindly old gentleman who owned it, as he was ready to retire. After only 2 years, we were ready to expand to 2 stores. And my parents' persistence and determination had paid off, and although we weren't what most folks would call filthy rich, we weren't exactly hurting for money either. My mother's salary paid for the mortgage on our house, and the profits from our family business paid for all the bills and upkeep of my father's new Dodge truck and my mother's Honda SUV. Everything else went into savings and the college fund for me and my sister. When I turned 18, it was a very proud day for my family and I. Dad always said, "From now on, it will be a tradition in our family that we serve this great country which has blessed us so much. Before our kids leave for college, they must serve a few years in the armed forces of the United States. There you will meet other people of other nationalities and customs. You will serve together and become a team together. You will adapt and overcome many challenges together, and when you leave the military, you'll see how America is such a great melting pot of people, cultures, and ideas. When you take that experience to college, you'll be all the more better experienced and mature than your peers." Well, I was prouder still the day that I graduated from the U.S. Marine Corps boot camp at Parris Island, South Carolina. The training was tough, but the training had to be tough if you wanted to earn the right to be one of the few and the proud. I'm only 5'5", but I was also a fast runner, and I could navigate any obstacle course with ease, so the drill sergeants gave me the nickname Bambi. I'd lost about 15 pounds during my time there, but it was replaced with rock-hard muscle and the confidence to know that I was the deadliest weapon on the battlefield. Standing there, sharp and lean in my dress blues with my fellow platoon of Marines, I still remember the look of immense pride in the faces of my father and my mother and my little sister. Those looks turned to complete horror on that terrible and tragic morning. My father said that he was looking for locations to open a third store in New York City when he saw the smoke rising from the island as the buildings collapsed. The United States, my country, the one which had taken care of my family and protected us with freedoms that are not enjoyed by so many others, had been attacked. And we were at war. I was attending the Mountain Warfare Training Center in Bridgeport, California, when I got word that my unit back at 29 Palms was going to war to hit back at the bastards who killed thousands of innocent people. Well, to tell you the truth, I think at the time we all wanted to go to war. We were Marines, damn it. If you attack our country, we'll blow yours to hell. On my last phone call home, before leaving for Afghanistan, my mother was sobbing, telling me to be safe and come home when it was over. Well, my sister was also crying, but I told her to be brave and assured her that what I was doing was to keep her safe. But what really broke my heart was my father's voice. He'd always been so confident and strong. He always knew exactly what to say to give me confidence. However, in a shaky voice, he could only say, "I love you, son." It cannot be underestimated the horrors and atrocities that the enemy had inflicted upon the people of Afghanistan. Men, women, children, babies, whole families and even entire villages were wiped out by the Taliban, so I had absolutely no sympathy for them when we called in tactical airstrikes and our AH-1 Viper attack helicopters rained brimstone and hellfire on them. In combat, the Taliban were complete cowards, hiding behind the very same women and little girls that they'd been brutalizing. Now, I'm not a politically partisan man, so I don't care what anyone thinks about the merits of going to war to fight global terrorism. But I will say this. Even if the terrorist attacks of 9/11 had never occurred, we still needed to be in Afghanistan to wipe out this Taliban cancer which was torturing and killing these young girls. I would not let that kind of sick depravity of Sharia law come to America and hurt my mother and little sister. I was part of a reconnaissance squad in my battalion's reconnaissance platoon. The squad usually operated in 6-man teams under command of a sergeant, and all 4 of the teams were there under the command of a lieutenant. We were operating in heavy mountainous terrain just east of Bagram Air Base in Parwan province, patrolling the steep rises, the jagged hilltops and valleys, and the numerous cave systems, relentlessly looking for the elusive enemy. At least 2 or 3 Taliban mortar positions had been shelling Bagram Air Base at night, so we were just being sent out to find them. My 6-man recon team consisted of our team leader, Staff Sergeant Perez, a short, stocky, by-the-book Marine with a permanent buzz cut who was originally from Mexico City, Mexico. Completely fearless and a natural leader, Sergeant Perez was a former drill sergeant who'd volunteered to deploy to Afghanistan. Our radio operator was a young Filipino private, first class, named Lampas, who was originally from Davao in the Philippines. Because he was the newest member of the team, Lampas had to hump the radio. The team's M249 squad automatic weapon gunner was Big Lance Corporal DeLine, a young black Marine from Brooklyn, Illinois. We had what is called a LAV-25 attached to our squad. A LAV, or Light Armored Vehicle, is an 8-wheeled armored reconnaissance vehicle that mounted a 25mm chain gun and 2 smaller machine guns mounted on a turret. The LAV's commander was Sergeant Big Mac McCostin, the only Marine in the squad who was shorter than I was. But the white Marine from Clawson, Michigan was built like a brick wall. He'd been preparing to become a wrestler on our US Olympic team, but put that aside to come to Afghanistan to fight the Taliban terrorists. Corporal Pinkerton was the only other white Marine in the squad. He was from the small town of Weed, California, and yes, he was a stoner before he joined the Corps, and found that he had a knack to fix just about anything that had gears and wheels. And I was the squad's grenadier. My M4 rifle had what was called an M203 grenade launcher slung under the barrel of the rifle, which could launch a variety of 40mm grenades at the enemy. Over my vest, which carried my rifle ammunition, I also wore a second vest which had small compartments for my grenades. I had HE, high explosive, grenade rounds, incendiary rounds, smoke rounds, and even CS tear gas grenades. I was like the squad's mini artillery. The M203 was breech-loaded, meaning that you had to break the M203 in half, load a single grenade into the rear of the launcher, then close the launcher again. When firing the M203, it gave off a soft but satisfying thump noise. As such, the M203 was affectionately known as the Thumper, and because I still retain my nickname from basic training, my weapon and I were known collectively as Bambi and Thumper. Our recon squad could lay down a tremendous amount of firepower, and we confidently piled into our LAV-25 and left Bagram just before midnight, headed into enemy territory which we called Indian Country. Guided by the moonlight and his night vision devices, Corporal Pinkerton drove us over the rocky terrain as we rumbled roughly due west towards the jagged stone mountains about 4 miles distant. We had another recon team which was operating north of us, while several other teams were airlifted and dropped on the ridge line, so we weren't alone on this operation. But at this time, the US was still in the process of bringing in more Marines and Army grunts into the theater, so we were pretty spread thin. Our objective was to observe a trail that our drones had discovered which wound up on the narrow trails into the mountains, which ended at the mouth of a large cave hidden under a rocky overhang. The cave was located about 300 feet above the valley floor, and Pinkerton was able to get us up a narrow goat trail for about 200 feet before we had to pull off the trail. The goat trail was too narrow for the lav to go any further. Sergeant McCostin guided the lav back into a crevice about 100 feet, and facing back down the trail, we'd just gone up. Inside that little rocky crevice, our giant lav was swallowed up in darkness. Even if the Taliban had night vision devices, they would have been hard-pressed to see our armored transport. Staff Sergeant Perez had Lampas, Deline, and me quietly dismount from the back ramp of the lav, as we would have to climb the rest of the way to our objective. He told Sergeant McCostin and Corporal Pinkerton to stay with the lav and keep the gun turret pointed down the trail. Since the radio on the lav had a greater range than our man-portable radio, the lav would also act as a communication relay between our squad and Bagram. Using our night vision devices, Perez led us slowly and cautiously up the rocky trail, carefully looking for signs of booby traps and cautioning us whenever the trail became so narrow that a wrong step would send us tumbling over the edge. Staff Sergeant Perez moved stealthily, as if he'd owned the entire mountain, and spoke with a confidence that made us all believe that we were the masters of this valley of death. We moved slowly, less than an arm's length from the Marine in front of us. Private Lampas was behind Perez with the radio, and Deline was behind Lampas with the squad automatic weapon, while me and my trusty Thumper brought up the rear. We finally got to a somewhat level plateau on the ridge, and wisely, Perez decided to move us off the trail which leads to the mouth of the cave. He had us form a tight perimeter as we scanned our objective. The cave was about 75 feet from us. It was actually at the end of a cul-de-sac where the goat trail ended at a steep drop. The cave was surrounded on two sides by the sheer rock walls, and with the steep drop-off directly to the left of the cave mouth. This meant that there was only one route in and one route out of the cave. A rocky overhang extended about 8 feet beyond the ceiling of the mouth of the cave, meaning that it would have been very difficult to spot the cave entrance from the air. "We need to go to a position above the cave on the rocks opposite where we can observe," Sergeant Perez whispered. "I'll go, Sergeant," I said, having just gone to the mountain warfare course. "Okay, Bambi," said Perez. "Hand me your weapon so it won't hinder you, and be careful." I handed my weapon off to Deline and backtracked about 10 feet down the trail, where I remember seeing a path which led up the side of the trail. This side path was even narrower than the one we were on, and the footing was even more precarious, as the loose gravel and stone threatened to twist feet and ankles. Finally, however, I came to a rock ledge about 5 feet high and hauled myself up and over, hugging the ground once I'd gotten up. I discovered that I was on a relatively flat surface, roughly 10 feet long by 4 feet wide, and surrounded on 3 sides by rock outcroppings that were between 3 to 4 feet high. About 15 feet below me, and about 100 feet away, was the mouth of the cave. This couldn't have been a more perfect spot to observe what Captain Taliban and his band of merry lunatics were up to. I climbed back to the spot, and carefully made my way back down to the squad where I reported to Sergeant Perez what I'd found. Good work, Bambi, Perez said. Stay close behind me and let's go check it out. I guided Perez up the same narrow path that I'd taken with Lampas and Deline following close behind, until we finally made it up to the rock ledge. Perez hauled himself up and, staying low, pulled all of us up on the ledge. This'll do just fine, he whispered. Bambi, you hunker down on the left and scan everything forward and to our left. Deline, get in the middle and train your SAW at the mouth of the cave. Lampas, I need you to keep an eye on the trail and make sure nobody can get in behind us. Here, let me have the radio. It had taken us almost an hour to get into position, and Staff Sergeant Perez called Sergeant McCostin back at the LAV, telling him we were set. McCostin reported that one of our recon squads to the north of us had spotted suspected enemy movement in a shallow ravine between two low hills. Good copy, said Perez. Keep us informed of any movement coming up the trail. Out. We hunkered down on the hard rocky plateau, trying to get as comfortable as we could while making as little noise as possible. It was a cold night on that ridge, and winds would periodically whip up, making the night air even colder. At first I thought they were crazy to issue us Generation 3 cold weather gear for the desert, but now I knew why. But even with the thermal underclothes, fleece jackets, a wool balaclava, and our uniforms, it was still rather chilly. We were all lying prone on the cold ground, peering over the rocks and looking down at nothing but an empty cave mouth at the end of a lonely trail, while our brothers in another squad were in contact with possible enemy forces. It was about 2 a.m, and my eyes were getting crossed, looking through my NVGs into the dark. I could feel myself dozing off when, suddenly, behind us, about 2 miles from our location, a bright light followed by white smoke seemed to loom out of the ground and ascend into the air headed towards Bagram. The Taliban's fired a Chinese 122mm surface-to-surface rocket at the base, whispered Perez. We watched helplessly as the unguided rocket looped and descended towards our base. Seconds later, 4 bright orange flares blossomed in the sky above the Taliban launch site as the Americans marked the enemy position. In the clear night, we could see flashes of weapon fire in the distance and the noise of a firefight going on. All this was soon drowned out as red lights, resembling laser-like fingers of death, reached out of the sky and struck the Taliban positions. The noise like a buzzsaw ripped the air, and we could even feel slight vibration on the ground as thousands of rounds of hot lead rained down on the Taliban. Looks like Spectre is up tonight, said Perez, grinning. Spectre's the code name for one of our AC-130 transport planes, modified to carry an astonishing array of weaponry and firepower, which the U.S. Air Force rains down on the bad guys. Soon, however, the brief light show was over, and just as quickly as it had started, the valley was now deathly quiet again. Sergeant McCostin called Staff Sergeant Perez from the lab, saying that the Taliban had gotten off one of these 3 missiles that they'd intended to fire at the base, and that some of Captain Taliban's merry lunatics were headed eastwards in our general direction. Perez said that was a good copy and instructed Sergeant McCostin to keep us updated before turning to us and saying, "Heads up, Maurice. We may have hostiles approaching soon." All of a sudden, all our thoughts of getting a few minutes of sleep went right out the window. Our weapons were all locked and loaded, and my Thumper had a 40mm HE high-explosive grenade already loaded into the breech. I thought for a moment and decided to silently eject that HE round from my grenade launcher and placed it back into one of my pouches. I reached into another pouch and pulled out an incendiary round and loaded it into my Thumper. If the Taliban were hiding 122mm rockets in that cave, an incendiary round would ignite the propellant, causing the rocket to explode. We lay there motionless for another 3 hours, as no further action had taken place anywhere in the area. It was just after 5 a.m, and the darkness around us was ever so slowly lightening into a dark purple sky. "We got movement to our direct front," whispered Sergeant McCostin from the lab. I count 5, 6, 7, at least a dozen personnel moving up the trail towards your position. They seem to be armed with AKs. Looks like they've been wounded. Roger, whispered Perez into the radio hand mic. Relay to headquarters that we have and maintain observation. Perez handed the mic back to Lampas and said, Stay alert, Marines. We have movement coming up the trail. It was still too dark to see without our NVGs, and the suspected Taliban approaching the cave entrance were lighting their way using cheap flashlights. Sure enough, there were about a dozen men armed with AK-47s approaching the cave, 2 of them lying on makeshift stretchers. None of the men were carrying anything larger than an AK-47. They had no mortars or rockets. Now, the rules of engagement at the time were pretty sketchy, since it was legal to own AK-47s. We couldn't just assume that these were Taliban. We actually had to see them commit a criminal act before we could do anything. And for all we knew, these could have just been local farmers who got caught up in the fighting and were just trying to get away. Maybe this cave was where they hid from the Taliban. Despite everything that was going on, despite the fact that thousands of innocents had died in the 9/11 attacks on America, we still insisted on giving everyone the benefit of the doubt here in Afghanistan. Everyone was considered innocent until they overtly show that they intend to commit a hostile act. The armed men seemed to show no concern about being tactically silent and weren't worried at all that they may have been under observation by US Marines. The heavily bearded young man who seemed to be the leader of the group tried to usher the men carrying the 2 stretchers into the cave. Strangely, however, some of the men seemed reluctant to enter the cave and had in fact dropped the 2 wounded men on the ground. The leader loudly chambered around into his AK-47, yelling in Pashtun and pointing towards the cave entrance. Well, the yelling went on for several seconds before the men who refused to go into the cave finally relented and they all disappeared into the entrance. "What do you make of that, Sergeant?" whispered Deline. "Different families, different factions, different tribes," said Perez. "All these people know is conflict and strife." "Do you think they're Taliban?" said Lampas. "Maybe," said Perez, "or maybe not. If they are friendly, we're obligated to help their wounded. Stay calm for now." Another 5 minutes passed when a loud barking roar, something like a dog's bark combined with a bear's growl, boomed from the cave. Several men screamed, and we could hear the frantic, undisciplined sounds of AK-47 rifle fire coming from inside, followed by the flashes of muzzle fire. The earlier argument had seemingly reached a boiling point, and the 2 factions of the same group turned violent against each other. But instead of hearing voices of rage, it seemed like all of the men shooting inside the cave were filled with voices of fear. This lasted for several seconds as the sounds of men fighting and apparently dying abruptly ceased, along with the rifle fire. Then there was silence, as something big but unseen seemed to be stirring inside the cave. "Sergeant Perez, are you in contact?" It was Sergeant McCostin calling from the lave. "Negative," replied Perez. "We're fine. Apparently there was some kind of altercation inside the cave and a lot of shooting. Call this in to Bagram." "Roger," said Sergeant McCostin. "Wait 1." Several minutes passed as McCostin reported the incident back to base. Meanwhile, we kept our eyes laser-focused on the cave. Whatever was moving around in there, perhaps a wounded man, had stopped. "Headquarters wants us to maintain observation and secure the position," radioed McCostin from the lave. "Company commander is sending up a relief platoon later in the morning once it gets lighter. Seems like they're still clearing the area from last night's attack." We sat for an indeterminate amount of time as the sky slowly went from a dark purple to a dark blue, with hints of red as the sun began clawing its way into the sky. Still, everything was silent inside the cave. "We need to go in there and see what's going on," said Perez. "There may be injured people that need assistance. Bambi, take point." "I'm moving, Sergeant," I said, happy to be able to get up and stretch my aching back and leg muscles. "Deline," said Perez, "take slack." "Moving, Sergeant," as he hefted to his SAW and followed me. Soon we were all down from our elevated perch and moving back down the narrow path towards the main trail. It was lighter now, so the going was smoother and faster, though no less precarious. We no longer needed our NVGs to see the path ahead of us. Sergeant Perez stopped us at the point where we stepped onto the trail. "Deline," said Perez, "take up a secure firing position here and watch our backs. We may be coming out of here in a hurry." "I'm on it, Sergeant," said Deline as he scooted a few feet back up the path to where he was in some cover and could watch the cave. "Let's move," instructed Sergeant Perez, and all three of us combat rushed across the trail and stacked on the right side of the cave entrance. Even standing outside, we could smell the scent of blood and carnage wafting from inside the cave like a slaughterhouse of raw flesh. I was in front, with Staff Sergeant Perez directly behind me and Lampas behind him. Perez said nothing, simply holding up 3 fingers. 2 fingers. 1. Go. Just as we trained, I went in first, swiftly covering everything to my front and to the left with my weapon. Simultaneously, Perez came in behind me and swept right, while Lampas immediately followed and swept front to rear. All of a sudden, behind me I heard Lampas retching as he stepped back. "Oh my God," he whispered, horrified that he just stepped into a pile of human entrails. My eyes began adjusting to the darkness inside the cave, and I heaved as I saw bodies and pieces of bodies stacked up like cordwood next to a wall deeper inside the cave, while all around us, piles of innards and guts had been strewed across the floor and walls. There was blood and streaks of blood everywhere. Without realizing it, I had lowered my weapon and was walking deeper into the cave. "Hold your positions," hissed Perez. "Take a knee and scan your sec." Something seemed to fall from the heights of the cave ceiling. Something big and hairy that smelled of wet and moldy fur. It landed directly behind me, and I felt something slam into my back and ribs like a baseball bat. I went flying into the side of the cave wall and slumped down with my ears ringing and the wind knocked out of me. I turned around and propped my back against the wall, my head spinning. Whatever this thing was had its back towards me now. It was covered in short fur and easily stood above 8 feet tall. From behind I could see that it had canine-like ears and legs like a dog or a wolf, and arms that were hideously long and muscular. The thing was facing Perez, who tried to raise his M4 to fire, but the thing backhanded Staff Sergeant Perez so hard that he was sent tumbling out of the cave. I watched in horror as Perez's body tumbled over the ravine and fall from view. Lampas was to the creature's left, and he opened up with his M4. At this close range, Lampas couldn't miss as he put at least 5 to 6 rounds center mass of the creature. However, the creature only looked annoyed as he swiped at Lampas. Lampas jumped back and slipped on the same pile of entrails he'd stepped in earlier. With the Lampas now on his back, the creature stalked towards him. I reached for my weapon and found that I didn't have it anymore. Looking around, I saw that I'd dropped it right where the creature had hit me. My Thumper was laying at the creature's feet, or paws, or whatever those massive things were. Still groggy from the blow I'd taken, I drunkenly ran forwards, towards the creature, and dived for my weapon, and fell far short. The creature closed in on Lampas, as Lampas struggled to pull his K-bar from its sheath. Suddenly, the entrance to the cave darkened as another figure entered. "Son of a..." yelled Deline as he lifted his SAW and put an 8-round burst directly into the creature's guts. Then another, and then another. The creature let out a pained howl and jumped nearly 15 feet towards Deline, knocking the SAW out of Deline's hands and slamming him into the ground. Deline's distraction gave me the seconds I needed to get up and grab my Thumper. Charging at the creature from behind and to its left, I screamed a battle cry of "Wah!" as I rammed him as hard as I could with the entire right side of my body. To my surprise, the creature went off balance, but so did I. I was now lying about 8 feet in front of the creature, with Deline and Lampas standing behind me near the mouth of the cave. I was again on my back, lying in a pile of human gore as I leveled my weapon up at the creature. I could now get a good look at its face. It definitely had canine features, with a short snout, wide jaws, and horrifically sharp and blood-stained teeth. "Get down! Get down!" I yelled at Lampas and Deline. "What are you?" said Deline. "Oh, shit!" yelled Lampas. The creature opened its maw wide in an angry growl, just as my weapon went thump. It was late in the afternoon when we were all finally piled into the back of the LAV, Corporal Pinkerton driving us all back to Bagram after his long patrol. A platoon of Marines and some Army EOD guys had arrived later on in the morning, and together we estimated that there were the bodies of at least 10 to 12 Taliban fighters inside that cave. We knew they were Taliban because the EOD guys also found fragments of at least 2 Chinese 122mm rockets and 3 Russian 82mm mortars, as well as some destroyed RPGs. They also found the rear hindquarters of what had to be a huge dog, which they assumed the Taliban were using as a watchdog to guard their stash of high explosives. When I fired my 40mm incendiary grenade at the Taliban fighters who were shooting at us, it set off their munitions and pretty much blew them all to hell. At least that's what Staff Sergeant Perez told the intel guys when they questioned us about the engagement, and the rest of us backed up Perez's story. I really don't know how long I was unconscious after I force-fed that creature with an incendiary grenade. I only remember waking up and being dragged across the Grand and out into the sunlight by Lampas and Deline. Deline came running when he saw Perez was being tossed out of the cave like a rag doll and over the side of the ravine. Well, fortunately, Perez fell on a ledge just 6 feet below the ravine and was groggy and woozy when we finally pulled him back up the trail. Since it was likely that the Taliban would use this cave again after we'd left, Staff Sergeant Perez suggested that our EOD guys blow the living crap out of it, and the guys were more than happy to oblige. They wired C4 all over the unexploded Taliban ordnance inside the cave, and wired the overhang of the entrance and detonated the charges in a booming explosion that knocked my lungs into my skull. It was beautiful. When the smoke cleared, it was just a pile of rocks where a cave used to be. The 4 of us were sitting in the back of the lav as we rumbled towards the base. Staff Sergeant Perez's arm was in a sling from his fall, and I had a nice big bandage on my head from where I was hit. Deline was scooping spaghetti and meatballs from an MRE into his mouth, and Lampas nearly threw up again. "Oh man, how can you eat that?" Lampas said. Deline shrugged. "I'm hungry. Mama Deline always told me that fighting werewolves is hard work, so eat as much as you can when you can." I shook my head and leaned back, closing my eyes and letting the rumble of the lav's engines rock me to sleep. "I think that the sun coming up weakened that creature," said Lampas. "That's why we were able to hurt it." "What do you think it was, Sergeant?" asked Deline. Staff Sergeant Perez, as pragmatic as he was stoic, simply shrugged. "I don't know. I don't care if you're some mythical bulletproof whatever the hell you are. If a Marine thumps an incendiary grenade down your throat, you're a rug, baby. I've since been promoted to the rank of Staff Sergeant, and because of that, I'm required to surrender my beloved Thumper for a regular M4 rifle. I haven't, though. No, I've kept my same Thumper through 1 combat tour of Afghanistan and 3 to Iraq. So sleep well, because Bambi and Thumper got your back."
So yes, I know. I pronounced Humvee wrong in the first story. I did actually know how to pronounce it. I'd never seen it written in its official form before. That's what kind of threw me all that time ago when I first read that story. Humvee. Yeah, I was a big fan of Command and Conquer Generals back in the day. That was an awesome computer game. If you ever get a chance to play it, please do. It was fantastic. Oh, more than 20 years ago, that. Getting on for 25. I can't remember when that was released, but yeah, used to play that a lot back in the day. And yeah, Humvees always bring that back to mind. Anyway, that was a compilation of stuff I did quite a while ago, mainly because I'm feeling a bit under the weather today, and also because I've got a couple of long stories on the go which I'm wanted to perfect, and I just wasn't able to do the editing as well today. So yeah, stuff's coming up. Good stuff. Just not today. Well, that was pretty good. I enjoyed those stories. Listening to them all again, that was a lot of fun. Anyway, thoughts, feelings, anything else you want to say in the comment section below the video, and as ever, I'll do my best to join in the conversation. That is enough for me for one evening, however. I will be back with the podcast tomorrow, and I'm back here on Friday. Like I said, something good coming up on Friday, so I hope you'll join me back here again then. Till the next time, my dear friends, very, very sweet dreams, and bye-bye.
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. Really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams. Bye-bye.